Somewhere beneath the grey Atlantic swells, a submarine is waiting. Not hunting, not attacking, just waiting. She carries no torpedoes in her forward tubes. Her crew has not been trained to stalk convoys or calculate firing solutions. The men aboard her are doing something far stranger, far less celebrated, and in many ways far more important than anything their combat counterparts were doing. They are waiting for other submarines to find them, and when those submarines arrive, exhausted, low on fuel, their crews hollow-eyed from weeks at sea, this vessel will give them everything they need to keep fighting. She is a milk cow, and almost nobody remembers she existed. This is the story of one of the Second World War's most quietly consequential programs. Not the story of aces and kill tallies, not the story of famous commanders or celebrated battles. This is the story of the ships that kept the ships fighting, the floating fuel depots that extended Germany's reach across an ocean far beyond what should have been physically possible. And it is a story that ends, as so many German naval stories do, not in triumph, but in slow, grinding, irreversible loss. Before we go any further, if you are here for a long, deeply researched, sleep-friendly documentary on one of the Second World War's most overlooked chapters, you are exactly where you need to be. Take a moment, get comfortable, and settle in. If this is the kind of content you come back to, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more where this is coming from, and we are just getting started tonight. Now, imagine for a moment that you are a German U-boat commander in the late months of 1942. You have been at sea for weeks. Your crew is exhausted. Your stores are running low. You are operating somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from your home port on the French coast, and you have just been informed that there is a convoy, a large one, heavily laden, moving slowly, somewhere within striking range, but your fuel bunkers are approaching empty. You do not have enough diesel to intercept, attack, and return home safely. You must make a choice. Either you break off and begin the long, dangerous voyage back to port, or you stay and risk never making it home at all. Now imagine that a second option exists. Imagine that somewhere ahead of you, at a set of coordinates transmitted in encrypted code, another submarine is waiting. This one carries the fuel you need, the food your crew is desperately short on, the spare parts your engineers have been improvising around for 3 weeks. You rendezvous with her on the surface in the middle of the night. You take on supplies, and then you turn back toward that convoy. This was the promise of the Type Thames U-boat. This was what the milk cow was supposed to do for the German war at sea. The idea was, in purely mechanical terms, extraordinarily elegant. The Battle of the Atlantic in its early years had been devastating to Allied shipping. Wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines attacking in formation, had torn through convoys with brutal efficiency. But even at the height of their success, German U-boats were constrained by a fundamental problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. They could only carry so much fuel. They could only remain at sea for so long before biology and physics forced them home. Their patrol areas were, by necessity, clustered around the edges of the Atlantic, close enough to port that they could safely return. The deep ocean, the vast mid-Atlantic reaches, the waters off the American eastern seaboard, the Caribbean. These were tantalizingly close to major shipping lanes, but just beyond the sustainable reach of most U-boat types, without resupply. And so someone, or more accurately, a great many someones working through layers of naval bureaucracy and engineering compromise, arrived at an answer. Build a submarine that does not fight. Build one that serves. Strip out the combat equipment, increase the internal volume, and fill every available space with diesel fuel, lubricating oil, food, medical supplies, spare torpedoes, and ammunition. Send this vessel out ahead of the wolf packs. Let the combat submarines find her, refuel from her, resupply from her, and then continue their patrols without breaking off. Treat logistics as a weapon. That was the concept, and for a time, a critical, bloody, consequential time, it worked. What makes the Type 14 program such a compelling story is not simply that it was innovative. Plenty of wartime programs were innovative. What makes it compelling is the particular nature of the problem it was trying to solve and the particular nature of how it ultimately failed. The milk cows were not defeated by poor engineering or flawed tactical doctrine. They were defeated by intelligence, by mathematics, by the Allied ability to listen, to decode, to locate, and to strike with weapons that improved faster than German countermeasures could adapt. Every time a milk cow transmitted her position to coordinate a rendezvous, she was, without knowing it, also transmitting that position to people who very much wanted to find her, and finding a slow, heavily laden, minimally armed submarine sitting on the surface while she pumps fuel through a hose to another submarine, that is not a military challenge. That is an opportunity. The Allies understood this. They built their response around it, and the milk cows burned. The men who served aboard Type 14 boats occupied one of the war's more peculiar and quietly terrifying niches. They carried other men's weapons. They sustained other men's patrols. They endured the same depths, the same pressure, the same claustrophobic misery of submarine life, but without the grim consolation of offensive action. They could not fight back in any meaningful sense. If they were found, their options were desperately limited, and they carried fuel. Thousands of tons of diesel fuel that, under the right conditions, did not simply sink a submarine, it incinerated one. There is something about that particular combination, the selflessness of the logistical role, the vulnerability of the supply mission, the catastrophic consequences of discovery, that deserves far more attention than it has ever received. The men who crewed conventional combat U-boats have been the subject of novels, films, memoirs, and monuments. The men who crewed milk cows are, for the most part, names in records that took decades to fully reach public archives. Tonight, we are going to change that. We are going to trace the Type 14 program from its origins in the strategic calculations of the German Naval Command all the way through to the final desperate missions of 1944 and 1945, when milk cows that had once symbolized German ambition became witnesses to German collapse. We will follow the logic of the program, the engineering of the vessels, the tactics of the patrols, and the Allied campaign that dismantled the fleet one boat at a time. We will not pretend that this is a story of heroes and villains in any simple sense. It is a story of men, on both sides, doing their jobs under conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty. It is a story of an innovation that was brilliant and brutal and ultimately insufficient. And it is a story about something the Second World War teaches again and again, in theatre after theatre, campaign after campaign, that wars are not won by the boldest idea. They are won by the side that can sustain the boldest idea long enough to make it matter. Germany could not, and the milk cows are the proof. So settle in. The Atlantic is dark, and the water is cold, and somewhere beneath it, a Type 14 is beginning her first patrol. The Atlantic Ocean in 1942 was not a battlefield in any conventional sense. There were no front lines drawn across its surface, no fortified positions, no hills to capture or cities to hold. It was something altogether more elemental, a vast, grey, indifferent expanse, stretching more than 3,000 kilometers between the ports of occupied Europe and the lifelines of Britain and the Soviet Union. And yet, beneath those cold, restless swells, a war of extraordinary consequence was being fought in near-total darkness. Steel vessels moved through the deep, hunting and being hunted in silence. The outcome of that submerged campaign would determine whether Britain ate, whether Soviet factories ran, whether American war materiel could reach the fronts that needed it most. It was a war of arithmetic as much as arms, and by the close of 1941, Germany believed it was winning. The instrument of that belief was the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine, the German naval force that had, since the opening months of the war, waged a campaign of almost surgical destruction against Allied merchant shipping. Submarine commanders who had already earned legendary reputations in their own country were racking up tonnages that seemed, on paper, to be strangling the Allied war effort. Their boats hunted in coordinated groups, striking convoys in the hours of darkness, slipping beneath the surface when escorts counterattacked, then surfacing again to communicate with headquarters and receive fresh orders. The wolf pack tactic, as it became known, transformed what had once been solitary predation into something approaching organized, coordinated maritime warfare. For a time, the results were devastating, but the men commanding those submarines understood something that the tonnage figures did not fully reveal. They understood geography. The Atlantic is not merely wide, it is deep in ways that punish the logistically unprepared. The most valuable targets, the fat, heavily laden merchant convoys, did not hug the coastlines where U-boats could easily reach them. They moved through mid-ocean, precisely because mid-ocean was beyond the reach of most land-based air cover. This same calculation, however, cut both ways. To reach those convoys, German submarines had to cross vast distances of open water, burning fuel on the transit, consuming the same precious resources that would eventually force them to turn for home. Every kilometer spent traveling to a hunting ground was a kilometer subtracted from the time that could be spent hunting. The Type XIV U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, was an engineering achievement of real distinction. It was fast enough on the surface, agile enough submerged, and armed with sufficient torpedoes to make itself dangerous on any patrol. What it was not, however, was long-ranged in any strategic sense. Fitted with the fuel capacity its hull allowed, a standard Type XIV could operate across a radius that stretched credibly into the mid-Atlantic. But credibly is not the same as comfortably, and comfortable is not the same as tactically decisive. When the arithmetic was worked through honestly, the reality emerged. A significant portion of every Type XIV patrol was spent in transit, moving toward and then away from the operational area rather than operating within it. Time on station, the period when a submarine was actually positioned to find, track, and attack shipping, was dramatically compressed by fuel constraints. A boat might spend almost as long reaching its patrol zone as it spent actually hunting within it. This was not a secret that the Kriegsmarine's leadership could easily ignore. The men at the top of the German submarine command were experienced naval officers who read their own patrol reports with careful attention. They could see, in the raw numbers, the shape of the problem forming. Submarines were sailing, finding targets, but returning to base with days or weeks of potential operational time surrendered to the necessity of refueling. The operational arc of each boat was a curve that bent sharply toward home at precisely the moment when it might otherwise be most effective. Skilled commanders navigating this reality developed instincts for stretching their fuel, reducing surface speed, limiting unnecessary maneuvers, timing their transits to take advantage of favorable conditions. but instinct and seamanship could only compensate for so much. Physics and chemistry are indifferent to tactical ingenuity. Meanwhile, the Allied merchant fleets, though suffering grievous losses, were not standing still. Shipyards in Britain, Canada, and the United States were accelerating their construction programs, driving down the time required to produce each new vessel. The Americans in particular were demonstrating an industrial momentum that would, given sufficient time, simply outpace the rate at which submarines could destroy tonnage. The German leadership recognized this trajectory. They understood that the window of opportunity, the period during which the U-boat arm could realistically strangle Allied supply, was not infinite. It required maximum pressure, sustained without interruption, across the broadest possible area of ocean. And maximum pressure, sustained without interruption, required boats that stayed on station rather than retreating to refuel. The urgency was not abstract. Every week, a submarine spent in transit or in port was a week removed from the campaign's most critical phase. There were partial solutions already in practice. Some German submarines had been modified or purpose-built to carry extra fuel, extending their range at the cost of other capabilities. Surface supply vessels had been used in earlier periods of the war to replenish submarines at sea, but these large, slow ships were themselves vulnerable and conspicuous. The surface ship solution had a limited shelf life in waters that Allied air and naval power was steadily contesting. What was needed was something more resilient, more concealable, more fundamentally suited to the conditions of the submarine war. The answer, when it finally formed clearly in the minds of German planners, was both elegant and radical. Build a submarine whose purpose was not to fight but to feed. The concept was, in military terms, a force multiplier, a way of compounding the effectiveness of existing assets without simply adding more of those assets. A conventional U-boat could carry enough fuel and supplies to sustain itself. A purpose-built supply submarine, stripped of its offensive armament and reconfigured as a floating depot, could carry fuel for multiple boats, spare torpedoes, food, medical supplies, and technical support materials. It would submerge when threatened, surface to conduct transfers when conditions allowed, and extend the operational reach of every submarine it serviced. A wolf pack resupplied at sea did not need to break off contact with a convoy to run home for fuel. It could refuel, reload where ammunition permitted, take on fresh provisions, and return to the hunt within days rather than weeks. The cumulative effect on the tempo of operations would, in theory, be transformative. If a standard operational patrol lasted, from departure to return, something in the range of 6 to 8 weeks, and if a substantial fraction of that time was consumed by transit, then refueling at sea could effectively double or even triple the time a submarine spent in active hunting. The same number of submarines properly supplied at sea would function as a fleet perhaps twice or 3 times their nominal size in terms of effective operational presence. For a navy that could not simply build submarines as fast as Allied shipyards built merchant ships, this kind of force multiplication was not a luxury. It was a strategic necessity. What crystallized the thinking among German naval planners in the early months of 1942 was the dawning recognition that the Atlantic campaign had entered a new phase, one defined not by the bravery or skill of individual commanders, but by the underlying logic of attrition. The Allies were learning, their convoy systems were improving, their anti-submarine tactics were slowly, methodically becoming more sophisticated. The pure aggression that had worked so well in the early war years was running against an opponent that was getting better at surviving it. If Germany was going to win the tonnage war, sink ships faster than they could be replaced, then German submarines needed to be everywhere, at all times, in numbers the enemy's defences could not adequately cover, and being everywhere, at all times, required fuel that the existing supply system simply could not deliver. The solution crystallized into formal plans. A new class of submarine would be designed and built, not a weapon in the traditional sense, but a system of sustenance. It would carry no torpedoes for offensive use. Its hull would be given over almost entirely to storage. Fuel oil, lubricants, food, fresh water, spare parts, and everything a combat submarine might need to continue operating far from any friendly port. It would rendezvous with wolf packs in pre-arranged positions, transfer its cargo across often violent open water, and either return to base for reloading or continue to other rendezvous positions as circumstances allowed. Those who authorized the design understood the gamble embedded in it. And so the planning began, driven by necessity, shaped by ambition, and shadowed by the question that no admiral's chart could quite answer: whether a supply boat could survive long enough in contested waters to matter. The war beneath the Atlantic was being lost in a conference room before it was ever lost at sea. By the early months of 1942, senior officers within the Kriegsmarine gathered over charts and tide tables, their cigarettes burning down to stubs while figures were passed around the table that no one wanted to read aloud. The numbers told a story of geometry, pure and brutal. The distance between a German port and the most profitable hunting grounds in the mid-Atlantic was simply too great for a standard combat submarine to cover, with enough fuel remaining to fight. A U-boat that had spent 10 days steaming to reach its patrol area arrived already depleted, its crew tired, its fuel bunkers drawing low before the first convoy was even sighted. The window of actual combat endurance, once the arithmetic of distance was accounted for, shrank to something almost embarrassing relative to the strategic ambitions being placed upon it. Officers had been papering over this reality with aggressive patrol scheduling and optimistic range projections. By 1942, that paper was wearing thin. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz understood the mathematics with the clarity of a man who had commanded submarines himself. He knew that the Atlantic was not simply a body of water. It was a vast buffer that ate time and fuel with equal indifference. His wolf pack doctrine was elegant in concept: mass boats against convoys, overwhelm escorts through sheer coordinated aggression, sink faster than Allied yards could build. But wolf packs could only mass where they could reach, and they could only fight for as long as their fuel tanks permitted. The convoy routes had shifted, and Allied coverage had thickened, pushing the most lucrative ambush positions ever further west and south. Dönitz did not need more submarines alone. He needed a way to keep the submarines he already had on station, hunting, long after their bunkers should have driven them home. The answer, when it finally took formal shape, was counterintuitive enough to require real persuasion at the highest levels of German naval planning. The concept that emerged was not entirely without precedent in naval thinking. Surface fleets had long understood the value of colliers and tankers, vessels that existed not to fight, but to sustain those that did. The Imperial German Navy of the First World War had experimented with submarine tenders and support vessels operating from neutral ports. But what was being proposed now was fundamentally different in scale and ambition. A submarine specifically designed and purpose-built to resupply other submarines at sea, far from any port, operating in contested waters where surface tenders could not safely venture. The idea was to take the principle of underway replenishment, already practiced by surface forces with some success, and drive it beneath the waves. A submarine that carried fuel for other submarines, fresh provisions, spare torpedoes, medical supplies, and the 100 small necessities of sustained undersea warfare. A vessel that was, in every practical sense, a floating base camp disguised as a warship. The planning discussions that shaped the Type 14 concept required a particular kind of strategic imagination, because the officers and engineers involved had to resist every instinct that submarine design had accumulated over decades. Traditional submarine design began with the weapon and worked outward. How many torpedoes? How large a gun? How deep a dive? How fast a surface sprint? Every other consideration, crew comfort, range, cargo, existed in subordination to the fighting capacity of the boat. To design a submarine that deliberately surrendered most of those fighting attributes in favor of cargo space and fuel storage required treating logistics not as a burden but as a capability. It meant arguing, in rooms full of men trained to think offensively, that a boat which could not fire a torpedo was as valuable as one that could. That argument required data, and the data from existing patrol reports made it powerfully. The mathematics of lost operational time, boats recalled early, wolf packs dissolved by empty fuel gauges, these numbers built the case more eloquently than any admiral's rhetoric. Early design sketches circulated through German naval engineering offices, carrying dimensions that surprised even experienced submarine builders. The Type 14 would be substantially larger than the standard Type 7 combat boat that formed the backbone of the U-boat fleet, requiring a hull broad enough to accommodate the fuel tanks, ballast arrangements, and cargo storage that the mission demanded. Where a combat submarine's interior was a compressed maze of weapon systems, machinery, and the bare minimum of human accommodation, the Type 14 had to find space for hundreds of tons of diesel fuel destined for other boats, provisions measured in weeks rather than days, and torpedo reloads that could arm a wolf pack for a second engagement after the first had exhausted their magazines. The challenge of packing all of this into a hull that still had to dive, still had to maneuver, and still had to withstand the crushing pressures of operational depths was not a trivial engineering exercise. Naval architects went through multiple iterations, balancing the competing demands with the knowledge that every compromise made in a drawing office might cost lives at sea. Structural integrity presented a particular headache. Fuel and provisions have different weights, different distribution requirements, and different behavior under the stresses of depth changes and pressure cycling. A submarine hull, loaded heavily and unevenly, is a submarine that handles poorly, dives sluggishly, and surfaces predictably, none of which were traits a vessel operating in contested waters could afford. Engineers devised internal arrangements that spread the load as evenly as the available space permitted, designing transfer systems that could pump fuel to a receiving submarine during a surface rendezvous without compromising the Type 14's own trim or stability. These were technical problems that had no established textbook solutions, because no one had built a purpose-designed submarine tanker before. The men solving them were working at the edge of what the existing engineering literature could offer, filling in the gaps with calculation and educated improvisation. Defensive armament generated considerable debate. A boat that carried no torpedoes was, in the traditional sense, defenseless against another submarine. It could not fight back underwater, could not threaten an attacker into breaking off contact, and could not trade blow for blow if caught on the surface. The decision was made to fit anti-aircraft weaponry, accepting that air attack rather than surface or submarine engagement was the more likely threat in the operational environment the Type 14 would inhabit. This was a reasonable assessment in the early planning stages, when Allied long-range air coverage over the mid-Atlantic was still limited and patchy. The anti-aircraft armament gave crews a fighting chance against aircraft and preserved a degree of deterrence against surface threats. It did not and could not make the Type 14 a combatant in any serious sense. The planners knew this. They accepted it as the price of the concept, trusting that the strategic value of the supply mission would outweigh the tactical vulnerability of the supply boat. The question of crew requirements also demanded fresh thinking. A combat submarine's crew were predominantly weapons specialists, torpedo operators, watch officers trained to identify and attack targets, men whose entire existence at sea was oriented around the moment of engagement. The Type 14 needed specialists of a different kind. Engineers capable of managing complex fuel transfer operations under time pressure. Medical personnel who could treat injured crewmen brought alongside from damaged boats. Men with the temperament to perform their function without the adrenaline of the hunt to sustain them, supplying someone else's victory in the middle of an ocean that was trying to kill you, while carrying no means of striking back. This was a different psychological proposition entirely. The planners recognized, at least in outline, that the crews of supply boats would face pressures distinct from those of combat submariners. How well that recognition translated into practical preparation was a question that operational service would eventually answer. What the design process ultimately produced was a vessel of unusual character, large, slow relative to combat submarines, visually distinctive to anyone who knew what they were looking at, and entirely dependent for its survival on the invisibility of the ocean itself. The Type 14 was not meant to be seen. Its weapon was its cargo, and its tactics were concealment and coordination rather than aggression and evasion. The supply boat concept demanded that two submarines appear at the same point in a trackless ocean at a pre-arranged time, neither having communicated their position in the hours before the meeting, both having navigated through weather and enemy contact to execute a transfer that surface forces considered routine but that had never been practiced underwater by anyone. The coordination problem alone was staggering. It required cipher communications precise enough to establish rendezvous positions without giving those positions away to enemy signals intelligence, and it required commanding officers confident enough in their navigation to trust a small square of ocean marked on a chart in a German port to still be empty of enemies when they arrived. The admirals who approved the Type 14 program were not naive men. They understood they were investing heavily in a concept that had never been proven at the operational level, in conditions that no peacetime exercise could adequately replicate. The investment was substantial. Each hull required shipyard time, skilled labor, raw materials, and crew that might otherwise have gone toward combat submarines. The return on that investment depended entirely on the supply boats surviving long enough to perform their function, and survival depended on Allied ignorance of exactly what was being built and where it would operate. That ignorance could not be guaranteed, and every officer in those planning sessions knew it. The decision to proceed was therefore not an act of engineering confidence alone, it was an act of strategic necessity. The alternative was to accept that the Wolfpack campaign would progressively wither as operational radius failed to keep pace with Allied countermeasures. The milk cow, whatever its risks, offered something the existing fleet could not: time. The formal approval of the Type 14 program committed the Kriegsmarine to a course of action that was, in its own way, a quiet acknowledgement of how far German naval strategy had already been forced to improvise. It was born from a structural problem that firepower alone could never solve, a problem not of will or courage or tactical skill, but of simple, unforgiving distance. The men in those conference rooms, bending over charts and engineering drawings in the grey early months of 1942, were building something that had no name yet in the vocabulary of naval warfare. They were building a new kind of weapon, one measured not in calibers or knots or torpedo loads, but in the thousands of kilometers of additional ocean that a wolf pack might now reach and hold. That weapon was almost ready to sail. On the drawing boards of the Kriegsmarine, an idea had begun to take shape that no naval engineer had been asked to solve before. Not how to destroy an enemy vessel, not how to dive faster, run deeper, or fire farther. The question posed to Germany's submarine designers in the early months of 1942 was stranger, more clinical, and in its own way, more ambitious. How do you build a submarine that exists entirely to sustain other submarines? How do you take a weapon system and strip away its weapons, filling the space with oil and provisions and compressed air, and still produce something that can survive alone in the open Atlantic? The men who received this commission were not lacking in skill. They were lacking in precedent. There was no blueprint for what they were being asked to build, no comparable vessel from any previous war to examine and adapt. They would have to reason from first principles, and they would have to reason quickly. The design that emerged was designated the Type 14, and from its earliest specifications, it announced itself as a vessel of radical compromise. Where a conventional combat submarine was lean and predatory, shaped around the torpedo tubes at its bow and stern, the Type 14 was broad and deliberate, a different kind of machine entirely. Its hull was enlarged substantially beyond any operational U-boat then in service, not to carry weapons, but to carry the means by which other submarines could continue carrying theirs. Internal tankage for diesel fuel occupied great portions of the pressure hull, along with reserves of lubricating oil, fresh water, food stores, spare torpedoes, ammunition, and medical supplies. The silhouette that emerged from the drafting table looked, to experienced U-boat commanders who reviewed the plans, almost uncomfortable. Too wide, too heavy, too slow. But the designers understood something those commanders did not yet fully appreciate. The war in the Atlantic was no longer simply a matter of who could sink more ships. It was becoming a matter of who could sustain the fight at greater distance and for greater duration. The Type 14 was the answer to that question, even if it was an answer that generated immediate unease. The engineering problems were not theoretical. They were immediate, physical, and deeply inconvenient. A conventional U-boat was designed with its weight distribution tuned carefully around a predictable internal arrangement. Propulsion machinery here, torpedo rooms there, fuel bunkers flanking the keel. The Type 14 upset almost every assumption that formula relied upon. Carrying external fuel for transfer to other submarines meant that the vessel's buoyancy and trim would shift dramatically as it delivered its cargo. A boat that handled one way when fully laden would handle in an entirely different way as its supplies were drawn down over the course of a patrol. The naval architects had to design systems that could compensate for this changing weight profile: ballast arrangements, trim tanks, flooding and pumping configurations, all while ensuring the hull itself remained structurally sound under the pressures of Atlantic diving depth. Steel specifications were reviewed and in some cases upgraded. Weld integrity requirements became more exacting. What looked from the outside like a storage vessel was, from the inside, an engineering exercise in controlled instability. Then there was the matter of the transfer apparatus itself. A supply boat is only useful if it can actually move its cargo from one hull to another in open ocean conditions, often at night, often in weather that the Atlantic generates with absolute indifference to naval schedules. Engineers developed pumping systems for fuel transfer, rigging solutions for passing physical stores across the water between surfaced submarines, and hose connections capable of maintaining seal under the tension and movement of two separate vessels riding the same swell. These were not elegant solutions. They were workmanlike, practical, and hard-won through iteration. The crews who would eventually operate them in the field would discover additional problems that no drafting table had anticipated, but the baseline engineering delivered something that functioned. Getting to that baseline required months of argument between competing requirements and more than a few designs that were drawn, evaluated, and quietly abandoned. Construction itself began at several German shipyards across the Reich, though the demands placed on German industrial capacity by 1942 were already severe. Steel, skilled labor, specialized components, all of these were contested resources in a war economy under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The shipyards tasked with producing the Type 14 hulls were simultaneously maintaining output on combat submarines, surface vessels, and the repair work generated by a navy in continuous engagement. Fitting the milk cow program into those competing schedules required both administrative insistence from the Kriegsmarine and a degree of improvisation from yard managers who were juggling priorities no peacetime planner had ever contemplated. Workers who had spent years building one kind of hull were now being asked to build something that looked similar from the outside but was configured entirely differently within. Training had to follow the design, and both had to keep pace with a war that waited for neither. Roughly 23 of these vessels were ordered across the full span of the Type 14 program, though not all would reach completion, and those that did would carry individual variations reflecting the adjustments accumulated through the building process. Early hulls were completed to one specification. Later ones incorporated lessons from the first operational patrols and from the evolving threat environment that Allied anti-submarine forces were rapidly developing. A modification that made sense in the summer of 1942 was sometimes already obsolete by the time the boat it had been applied to was ready for sea trials. The pace of change on both sides of the Atlantic was faster than the pace of construction, and German shipyard workers building to a drawing approved months earlier could not always know that the assumptions behind that drawing had shifted. This is one of the quieter ironies of industrial warfare. The gap between a decision and its physical consequence is measured in steel and time in 1942 was a currency neither side could afford to waste. Defensive armament presented its own category of difficult choices. The Type 14 was not designed to fight. Its entire purpose was to avoid combat, to find its client submarines at an arranged position in open water, complete its transfer, and withdraw. Yet sending a vessel into the Atlantic with no means of self-defense at all was a calculation even the most optimistic planning officer could not justify. The solution applied was a minimal one: anti-aircraft guns and, in some configurations, deck armament sufficient to deter a surfaced threat, but wholly inadequate against any determined attack. The naval architects knew this. The commanders who approved the design knew this. Everyone in the chain of decision knew that a Type 14 which came under sustained air or surface attack was not going to fight its way clear. What they chose to believe, or perhaps chose to require themselves to believe, was that the supply boats would be able to rely on concealment, communication discipline, and operational timing to avoid the moments when those minimal guns would be needed. That belief would be tested, and tested severely, in the months ahead. The men selected to oversee final construction and early sea trials were experienced submarine engineers, though the vessel they were now signing their names to was unlike anything they had previously brought through completion. Sea trials for the first Type 14 hulls produced data that was, by turns, reassuring and sobering. Diving performance was adequate for the design parameters, not exceptional, but within the tolerances the Kriegsmarine had established. Surface handling in rough weather was demanding, the broad hull rolling more than a combat boat would in comparable conditions. Speed was limited, as the weight of cargo and the drag of the larger displacement combined to keep the vessel from achieving the kind of surface velocity that might help it outrun a threat. The men reviewing these trial results understood that the Type 14 would survive in the Atlantic only as long as the Atlantic let it pass unnoticed. The moment it attracted attention, its virtues became vulnerabilities. The cargo that gave it value was the same cargo that made it slow, conspicuous, and difficult to protect. And yet there was something that the trial results also confirmed, something that justified the entire endeavor. The transfer systems worked. The fuel pumps delivered their output. The hose connections held. The rigging for physical supply transfer could be rigged and secured in acceptable time. In controlled conditions, the Type 14 could do what it had been designed to do, and do it reliably. For the engineers and the yards and the planning officers who had committed months of scarce resources to this program, that confirmation carried a weight almost difficult to articulate. An idea had moved through conception, argument, design, compromise, and construction, and had emerged as a functional machine. Whatever risks lay ahead, and the trial officers were not naive about those risks, the fundamental concept had survived contact with reality. That was not nothing. In the compressed world of wartime development, where every failed prototype consumed irreplaceable capacity, producing something that worked was its own kind of victory. What the blueprints could not capture, and what the construction process could only partly address, was the human dimension of the vessels now taking shape on the slipways. The crews being assembled for the Type 14 program were submarine men by training, but they were being asked to operate in a mode that inverted almost everything that U-boat culture celebrated: speed, aggression, the hunt. These were the values around which the entire German submarine service had organized itself since the earliest patrols of the war. The Type 14 asked its crews to be patient, to be methodical, to measure success not in ships sunk, but in fuel transferred and supplies delivered. That was a profound psychological adjustment, and it would manifest in complex ways once these men were at sea. The builders could shape the steel. Shaping the expectations of the men inside it was a different and slower process. By the time the first Type 14 hulls were approaching readiness for operational assignment, the Battle of the Atlantic was already shifting in ways that would shape everything these vessels would be asked to do. Allied air coverage was expanding. Convoy escort doctrine was improving. Signals intelligence operations on both sides were accelerating in sophistication. The supply boats that German engineers had spent months designing and building were about to enter a war that was, in certain measurable respects, already different from the war that had generated the requirement for them. The gap between the world the blueprints assumed and the world the boats were sailing into was not yet decisive, not in early 1943, but it was real, and it was widening. The milk cow fleet was ready. What it would find at sea was something its builders had not fully been able to plan for. The winter of 1943 carries a particular kind of cold to the German naval yards. Not merely the cold of season, but the cold of pressure, of expectation, of a war that has already consumed more than anyone bargained for. The Battle of the Atlantic is entering its most brutal phase. Merchant vessels are going down by the dozens each month, and the men who command Germany's U-boat arm understand, with the clarity that only desperation can provide, that time is running out. Every week that passes without a decisive result in the Atlantic is a week the Allies spend building more ships, training more crews, and closing the technological gaps that have made German submarines so lethal. Into this atmosphere of controlled urgency, a new vessel edges away from the quayside, slower than anything in the fleet, broader in the beam, riding lower in the water than any combat submarine has a right to. She has no torpedoes in her bow tubes. She carries no offensive purpose in the conventional sense. She is something else entirely, and the men who watch her depart know it. That vessel is U-461, the first of the Type 14 supply submarines to complete her sea trials and enter active operational service. She is designated a Versorgungsboot, a supply boat, though the men who will come to depend on her prefer a different name. They call her a Milchkuh, a milk cow. The name carries a faint mockery, a gentle civilian absurdity dropped into the middle of a naval war, and yet it sticks with the kind of accuracy that only honest nicknames achieve. She does not hunt, she feeds. She carries fuel oil in quantities that would dwarf the reserves of a frontline combat boat, along with torpedoes, provisions, spare parts, medical supplies, and the 1,000 small necessities that a crew surviving weeks beneath the surface will eventually exhaust. Where a fighting submarine arrives at a rendezvous looking to destroy, U-461 arrives looking to sustain. The distinction is philosophical as much as it is technical, and the Kriegsmarine has committed enormous resources to proving that it matters. Her commanding officer takes her out into the Atlantic with a crew that has absorbed months of specialized training. Operating a Type 14 is not like operating a combat U-boat, and the differences are not merely mechanical. The rhythms of the mission are different. A combat crew measures its patrol in tonnage sunk, in contacts made, in the electric tension of attack runs and evasive maneuvering. The crew of a milk cow measures its patrol in deliveries completed, in boats sustained, in the quiet arithmetic of fuel transferred across open water. It is a profoundly unglamorous form of warfare, and no one pretends otherwise. The officers who have been assigned to supply boats understand that their careers will not be decorated by the kind of dramatic action that fills the pages of the German naval press. Their work is infrastructure. It is maintenance. It is the grinding, invisible labor that makes other people's victories possible. They carry this understanding with them as the coast disappears behind them and the Atlantic opens ahead. What waits for U-461 in those early weeks is a combination of procedural challenge and navigational discipline that her crew has prepared for but never truly tested. The rendezvous procedures that make the milk cow concept viable require a precision that admits almost no margin for error. A combat U-boat operating on extended patrol has consumed much of its fuel and most of its emotional reserves by the time it reaches a supply rendezvous. The crew is tired, the boat is stressed, and the commanding officer is operating on the compressed patience of a man who has been at sea far longer than is comfortable. Into this situation, U-461 must arrive at the correct coordinates, at the correct time, having navigated across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean without the kind of navigational landmarks that make precision easy. The mathematics of it demand a standard of seamanship that goes largely unacknowledged in the historical record, because it produced no dramatic outcomes, only successful transfers, which meant only that the war continued. The transfer procedures themselves are physically demanding in ways that shoreside planning cannot fully anticipate. Fuel is transferred through hoses rigged between vessels riding on open ocean swells. The sea does not cooperate with engineering requirements. Two submarines sitting on the surface in mid-Atlantic are subject to every variation of wind and wave that the ocean chooses to produce, and the hoses that connect them must flex and hold through all of it. Torpedoes are moved across open water in cradles designed for the purpose, but designed is not the same as perfected, and the men who maneuver them are doing so on the curved, wet deck of a submarine that was never intended to serve as a loading dock. Provisions are passed across in waterproofed containers. Technical personnel from U-461 sometimes board the receiving vessels to assist with repairs that cannot wait for a return to base. The whole operation takes hours, during which both submarines sit exposed on the surface, their silhouettes visible for considerable distances, their position fixed and predictable. Every man involved understands the exposure. No one mentions it more than necessary. The skepticism that accompanied U-461's departure has not disappeared. It has merely been suspended, held in abeyance by the practical demands of the patrol. Within the upper ranks of the Kriegsmarine, there are officers who have never been entirely convinced that the supply boat concept is sound. Their objection is not to the logistics, which are obviously sensible on paper, but to the tactical reality that a slow, large, unarmored vessel carrying enormous quantities of flammable liquid represents an extraordinary prize for any Allied aircraft or warship that finds her. The Type 14 cannot dive quickly. Her surface profile is larger than a combat U-boat's. She cannot run from trouble at any meaningful speed, and the defensive armament she carries is not designed to defeat the kinds of aircraft and warships that the Allies are deploying with increasing frequency. She is, in the blunt assessment of her critics, a target, a valuable target. A target that the enemy has every incentive to prioritize above almost any other. Against this skepticism stands the operational record of those first weeks, which is measured not in drama but in endurance. The combat U-boats that meet U-461 and receive her supplies do not sink immediately after the transfer. They continue. They push deeper into the Atlantic grid squares, where unrefueled boats could not go. They engage convoys that they would otherwise have had to abandon, their fuel reserves replenished, their torpedo loads partially restored, their commanding officers braced by the knowledge that withdrawal is no longer the only option. The wolf packs that the supply boat sustains remain on station for extended periods, and in those additional days and weeks, they press engagements that produce results. The tonnage mathematics shift, however slightly, in Germany's favor. This is what U-461 has been built to achieve, and in those early months, she achieves it. The concept works. The question that nobody can yet answer is how long it can continue to work before the Allies understand what they are looking at. Because the Allies are already paying attention. The pattern of extended U-boat patrols, the increased operational persistence of wolf packs in areas they have no business sustaining themselves, the curious regularity with which apparently exhausted submarines reappear with renewed aggressiveness, these patterns do not go unanalyzed. Allied naval intelligence is populated by people whose professional purpose is to notice exactly this kind of anomaly. The gradual piecing together of what the Germans have done, the logical deduction that something is resupplying the boats at sea, that there must exist a floating base somewhere in the Atlantic grid, happens with a methodical patience that will eventually prove lethal. But in the opening months of 1943, that reckoning is still accumulating, still building toward the point at which it becomes actionable. U-461 operates in a window of time that will not remain open indefinitely. The clock is running, even if the crew cannot hear it. There is something worth noting about the men who sail these supply boats, something that the glamorized accounts of submarine warfare tend to obscure. The crew of U-461 are not failed combat submariners reassigned to a lesser role. They are specialists, trained for a mission that demands different virtues than the ones celebrated in naval journalism. Their enemy is not the Allied convoy or the destroyer escort. Their enemy is the ocean itself, its distances, its unpredictability, its complete indifference to German operational schedules. They navigate by careful calculation across vast stretches of open water to meet boats whose own navigation has been tested by weeks of submerged running. When both vessels surface at the agreed coordinates and find each other waiting, this is not accident. It is craft. The officers who make this happen repeatedly, patrol after patrol, against weather and wear and mechanical attrition, are performing a kind of technical excellence that receives almost none of the recognition afforded to the men they keep in the fight. The maiden patrol of U-461 ends with her returning to port, having accomplished what she set out to do. The supply boat has sustained the wolf packs she was sent to find. The theoretical has become operational. The concept that existed in engineering offices and naval planning sessions has proven itself against the actual conditions of the Atlantic. There will be reports filed, assessments made, figures compiled, demonstrating the extension of patrol durations and the improvement in operational endurance. These reports will circulate through Kriegsmarine Command with the measured satisfaction of planners watching their plans take functional shape. The Type 14 program will be confirmed, its continuation authorized, its value acknowledged in the language of naval bureaucracy. U-461 has done what she was asked to do. Yet even as those reports move through command channels, the conditions that define U-461's operational environment are already shifting. The Atlantic is not the same body of water it was when the Type 14 program was conceived. Allied aircraft are appearing in areas where only months before a surfaced U-boat could operate with reasonable confidence. Escort carriers, those modest and unglamorous vessels that have transformed convoy protection, are extending their coverage into sea areas that were once effectively uncontested. Direction-finding technology is improving. Signals intelligence is accumulating. The next patrol of a milk cow will take place in an Atlantic that is measurably more hostile than the one the first patrol found. What has been proved possible will now have to be proved survivable, and these are not the same proof. The supply boats have begun their work. The hunters have begun theirs. The Atlantic is vast, almost beyond comprehension. At its widest, the ocean stretches more than 5,000 kilometers from continent to continent, a body of water so enormous that entire fleets could operate within it for weeks without encountering a single enemy vessel. For the German Kriegsmarine, that vastness had always been both an opportunity and a curse. The opportunity was obvious. Allied merchant shipping had to cross that water to sustain Britain, to fuel the Soviet war effort, to project American industrial power across an ocean. The curse was equally plain. A U-boat carried only so much fuel, only so many provisions, only so many days of operational endurance before it had to turn for home. The mid-ocean gap, that terrible stretch of open water beyond the reach of most land-based aircraft, had been the U-boat arm's best hunting ground. Now, with the Type 14 supply boats active, German command looked at that gap differently. It was no longer just a hunting ground, it was a home base. The orders that went out to Wolfpack commanders in early 1943 carried a new tone of ambition. Push further west, hold your position longer, the supply boat will come to you. For officers who had spent years calculating fuel margins with grim precision, rationing every submerged hour against the long run home, these orders felt almost disorienting. The arithmetic of submarine warfare had been rewritten almost overnight. A Type 7 combat boat, the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, carried enough fuel to operate for roughly 3 to 4 weeks at moderate range before its endurance became critical. With a single rendezvous alongside a milk cow, that endurance could be extended by weeks, sometimes by a full patrol duration again. Commanders who had been forced to withdraw from promising hunting grounds simply because their fuel gauges demanded it could now receive a top-up and return to the fight. The wolf packs, for a brief and extraordinary window, could behave as though geography no longer applied to them. Coordinating a resupply rendezvous in the open Atlantic required a kind of operational precision that the Kriegsmarine had never previously attempted at scale. A supply boat and a combat submarine are not surface vessels that can spot one another from the bridge and adjust course casually. They operate in 3 dimensions, often submerged for much of their passage, navigating by dead reckoning across featureless ocean. Getting 2 submarines to meet at a predetermined point, in weather that could shift from glassy calm to force 10 gales within hours, demanded meticulous planning. Naval operations staff in Germany developed coded rendezvous grids, timed departure schedules, and contingency meeting points that allowed some margin for the inevitable drift of navigation. Communications traffic between submarines and their shore commands increased substantially during this period, a detail that would carry enormous consequences later, but in those early months of 1943, the system worked with a reliability that surprised even its architects. The rendezvous itself, when it went to plan, was a remarkable piece of seamanship conducted under conditions of extraordinary stress. A combat U-boat would surface at the agreed coordinates, often in the early hours of morning to reduce visibility risk, and wait. Then the blunt, rounded silhouette of the Type 14 would emerge from the swell, low in the water, wide across the beam, moving at the deliberate pace of a vessel designed for carrying rather than running. Fuel hoses were passed across the gap between hulls. Torpedoes were transferred in a process that required teams of men working in the open, exposed to weather and to the constant possibility of being spotted from the air. Food, medical supplies, spare parts, and fresh bread. The milk cows carried bread, a small mercy that meant an extraordinary amount to men who had been eating stale provisions for weeks, were passed across in waterproof containers. The whole operation might take several hours. Every minute on the surface was a minute of exposure, but the exchange worked, and when a combat boat slipped back beneath the surface with full tanks and fresh supplies, its commanding officer had been given something almost unprecedented in submarine warfare: time. The operational results were not slow to appear. Wolfpack patrols that would previously have lasted 4 to 6 weeks began extending to 8, 9, even 10 weeks on station. Combat submarines that would have turned for France or Norway when their fuel reached critical levels instead remained in their patrol grids, waiting for convoys, repositioning as intelligence directed, pressing the tactical initiative rather than surrendering it to the logistics clock. Allied convoy planners, already struggling to balance escort resources against the sheer volume of shipping that had to cross the Atlantic, found themselves facing wolf packs that simply refused to go away. A convoy battle that might have ended when the attacking submarines exhausted their fuel now continued, as freshly resupplied boats took up the pursuit. The multiplication of effort was real, and in the tonnage registers of early 1943 it showed. There was something almost elegant about the concept in its early execution, a kind of distributed naval logistics that anticipated, in its basic structure, ideas that military planners would spend the rest of the 20th century refining. The aircraft carrier task group, the underway replenishment vessel, the forward supply base, all of these concepts rest on the same fundamental insight that the Type 14 program embodied. You do not bring the weapon to the supply depot, you bring the supply depot to the weapon. German naval planners had not invented the idea, but they had applied it to submarine warfare with a thoroughness that no navy had previously attempted, and in those first operational months, they were seeing the results they had hoped for. Yet the vulnerability was apparent from almost the first patrol. A Type 14 boat was built to carry, not to fight and not to run. Its hull was wide and generous with cargo space, a shape that traded hydrodynamic efficiency for volumetric capacity. This meant it was slow, both on the surface and submerged. Where a Type 7 combat boat could make 17 knots on the surface in good conditions, the milk cow was fortunate to manage 9 or 10. Submerged, the difference was less dramatic but still meaningful. In a world where the difference between survival and destruction was often the speed at which a submarine could dive and clear the surface, those lost knots mattered enormously. The supply boats carried defensive armament, anti-aircraft guns most prominently, but no torpedoes. They could not attack a threat. They could only absorb it or run from it, and they could not run fast. The men who served aboard Type 14s understood their position with uncomfortable clarity. Submariners are not given to sentimentality about risk. Every man who volunteered for the U-boat arm understood the statistical likelihood of his own death with a frankness that most military service does not demand. But the crew of a milk cow carried an additional psychological burden. They were not hunters. They did not fire weapons at the enemy. They floated, heavily laden with aviation fuel and diesel and ammunition, in the same ocean where Allied aircraft and warships were becoming more numerous and more skilled with each passing month. A combat U-boat, when attacked, could fight back, could dive, could maneuver, could threaten its attacker. The supply boat could do very little of this effectively. The fuel it carried, the very resource that made it so strategically valuable, was also the thing that made being caught on the surface so potentially catastrophic. Commanding officers of Type 14 boats developed their own operational disciplines in response to these realities. Surfacing windows were kept as short as the rendezvous operation allowed. Lookouts were posted with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive, scanning every quadrant of the sky continuously, because the threat almost always came from the air. Hydrophone operators listened with exhausting concentration for the sound signatures of escort vessels. Routes to rendezvous points were approached indirectly, never on the most obvious course, always with diversions built in to break any pattern that an attentive observer might begin to plot. These were reasonable precautions, professionally executed. In the first months of the program, they were enough. The Allied response had not yet fully oriented itself toward the specific problem of supply submarines, and the milk cows moved through their patrol areas with a freedom that would not last. The wolf packs themselves went through an adjustment of their own. Combat commanders had been trained in an ethos of independence. A U-boat at sea is sovereign, operating on its captain's judgment, responsible only to the orders it carried when it departed port. Now, there was a dependency built into the operational plan. The decision to press on, to stay on station, to accept one more week of patrol, rested partly on the assumption that the milk cow would be at the rendezvous when the time came. If the supply boat was late, or damaged, or simply not there, a combat boat with minimal fuel reserves was in a potentially desperate situation, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest friendly port. This dependency was not paralyzing. The Wolfpack commanders adapted to it with professional competence, but it introduced a new kind of tension into submarine operations. The hunter was now, in a meaningful sense, dependent on a vessel that could not defend itself. The operational picture in the spring of 1943, viewed from the perspective of German naval command, looked genuinely encouraging. Tonnage figures from the month of March alone were extraordinary by any measure, and the presence of Type 14 supply boats in the mid-Atlantic was a demonstrable factor in sustaining that operational tempo. The wolf packs were deeper into the ocean, longer on station, and more persistent in their pursuit of convoy targets than they had been at any previous point in the war. For a brief and deceptive moment, it appeared that the milk cow concept had genuinely reset the terms of the Battle of the Atlantic. What German planners could not yet fully see, though the evidence was accumulating at the margins of every operational report, was that the Allies were looking back, and they had begun to understand exactly what they were looking at. The supply boats had given the wolf packs new life. They had also given the enemy something new to hunt. By the spring of 1943, the North Atlantic had become something close to a killing floor. Convoys moved in tight formations, their escorts threading the outer edges like sheepdogs circling a herd that knew the wolves were close. For the men in those merchant ships, the engineers, the deckhands, the officers who slept with one eye open, each morning that arrived without a torpedo strike felt like borrowed time rather than safety. And now, for the first time in the war, the wolves were staying longer. They were not burning through their fuel and withdrawing. They were holding position, waiting, replenishing beneath the surface in the grey mid-Atlantic swells, then turning back toward the convoy lanes with full tanks and fresh orders. The milk cows had changed the arithmetic of the chase, and the convoys were beginning to feel it in ways that statistics alone could not fully capture. The pressure was sustained in a way it had never been before, and the convoy system, that great, painstaking Allied answer to the submarine threat, was being tested at depths it had not anticipated. What made this period so strategically volatile was the compounding effect of refueling on Wolfpack endurance. Before the Type 14 boats became operational, a U-boat commander faced an invisible countdown the moment his vessel cleared the Bay of Biscay. Fuel consumption, the weight of his torpedoes, the hours ticking against his food and freshwater stores, all of it created a natural ceiling on how long he could persist in any given engagement zone. He might harry a convoy for 2 or 3 days before mathematics forced him east and homeward. Now that ceiling had lifted. A boat that rendezvoused with a supply vessel somewhere in the mid-Atlantic could reload, refuel, and turn back toward the shipping lanes with an operational endurance that convoy commodores had not factored into their defensive calculations. The wolf packs that had once felt manageable, dangerous, surely, but bounded, were now appearing on the far side of engagements that should have concluded days earlier. Commodores began composing urgent signals requesting additional escort strength because the forces allocated under previous threat assessments were no longer sufficient. The spring convoy battles demonstrated this shift with brutal clarity. Wolf packs that had previously been scattered by escort pressure began regrouping rather than withdrawing, their fuel reserves refreshed, their commanding officers pushing back into contact. Surface escorts had been trained to drive submarines down and away, to force them to expend battery power and oxygen running deep before eventually surfacing far from the convoy track. That tactic depended on attrition, on the submarine eventually running out of something the escort had in abundance. But when the submarine could remedy its shortfalls somewhere out of escort range and return, the attritional logic began to bend. Escort commanders reported engagements that stretched across multiple days and hundreds of kilometers of ocean, their ships burning fuel at high speed, while their crews grew exhausted from sustained alert. The operational tempo the wolf packs could now maintain placed demands on Allied escorts that were straining command structures and supply chains on the Allied side as well. Yet even as the wolf packs achieved this new persistence, a quiet contradiction was building at the center of the German strategy. The Type 14 boats that made extended operations possible were themselves profoundly exposed during the very moments they were most needed. A supply rendezvous was not a brief encounter. Transferring fuel, provisions, and ammunition between submarines required both vessels to remain near stationary on the surface for extended periods, sometimes hours, depending on sea conditions and the number of boats being serviced. During those hours, neither boat could dive quickly enough to escape a fast-moving aircraft. The milk cow, deep-laden and slow, required significantly more time to get below the surface than any combat U-boat, and even after diving, her depth capacity and maneuverability were more restricted. She was, in those moments of service, essentially fixed in place. And fixed targets, as the war had already taught so many commanders on both sides, do not survive detection. The Allied response to the extended Wolfpack threat was itself an extension of a process already underway: the systematic reinforcement of convoy escorts and the forward deployment of air patrols. As spring deepened toward early summer, more escort carriers began appearing alongside convoy groups, their aircraft capable of reaching the ocean areas that shore-based patrols had never been able to cover adequately. The gap in the mid-Atlantic, that long stretch of open water beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either Newfoundland or Britain, had been a sanctuary for German submarines since the earliest days of the campaign. It was precisely into this gap that Type 14 boats had been routed for their supply operations, exploiting the absence of air coverage. Now that sanctuary was narrowing, escort carriers filled the gap imperfectly at first, their operations affected by weather and mechanical unreliability, but their presence alone forced U-boat commanders to alter their surface time and their rendezvous procedures in ways that reduced efficiency. For the commanding officers of the Type 14 boats, this narrowing of safe operational space created a pressure that was not purely tactical but deeply psychological. These men had accepted an unusual mission. They carried no offensive weapons of meaningful weight. Their purpose was service rather than destruction, and their survival depended not on aggression, but on concealment and speed. Both concealment and speed were qualities the Type 14 design had sacrificed in favor of cargo capacity. A milk cow commander watching the horizon after a multi-hour refueling operation occupied a particular kind of dread. He knew his boat was visible from the air at considerable distance, that his wake was distinctive, and that the radio traffic used to coordinate rendezvous positions was potentially being read by intelligence services he could not see or measure. He commanded a vessel that was strategically irreplaceable and tactically almost indefensible, and the gap between those two realities was where his anxiety lived. What made the situation still more complex was the way success and vulnerability existed simultaneously, often on the same patrol and sometimes on the same day. A Wolfpack resupplied by a Type 14 boat might successfully attack a convoy during the night hours, sending merchant ships to the bottom and forcing the escorts into frantic anti-submarine responses that cost them formation discipline and fuel. By any immediate measure, that counted as a German operational success. But a day or two later, an Allied aircraft might locate the milk cow responsible for that success, while she sat half-surfaced completing a second transfer cycle, and the balance would shift catastrophically in the other direction. The destruction of a single Type 14 boat erased not just one vessel, but the future operational reach of every combat U-boat that boat had been designated to serve. The exchange rate was profoundly unfavorable to Germany, even when the immediate tactical ledger suggested otherwise. The convoy commodores threading these dangerous waters understood something important that their immediate engagement reports perhaps did not fully communicate. The nature of the threat had changed qualitatively, not merely in scale. They were no longer fighting a force that attacked and withdrew. They were fighting a force that could sustain itself against them in the open ocean, and that shift required a different kind of defensive thinking. Convoys began routing more aggressively around known or suspected U-boat concentrations when intelligence permitted. Escort groups were reorganized to include dedicated sub-hunting units that could pursue contacts well away from the convoy without stripping the main body of protection. These adaptations took time and resources, and in the interval between problem and solution, merchant ships continued to go down. The spring and early summer of 1943 produced some of the war's most intense convoy battles, with losses on both sides accumulating at rates that pressed every level of command on the Allied side. Signals intelligence played a role that neither side could fully see or fully acknowledge in real time. The coordination required between Type 14 boats and the wolf packs they served demanded radio communication, position updates, rendezvous confirmations, changes to scheduled meeting points when conditions or threats intervened. Every transmission was a potential emission, a signal that could be triangulated or decoded by the Allied radio intelligence apparatus that was growing more sophisticated with each passing month. U-boat commanders had been warned repeatedly about radio discipline, but the operational demands of coordinating supply across hundreds of kilometers of empty ocean made some degree of transmission unavoidable. Each signal was a small risk, accumulated over weeks of operations. Those small risks formed a pattern, and patterns were what Allied intelligence had learned to read with increasing precision. The tension between what the milk cows enabled and what they cost the Germans was never more visible than in the operational rhythm of this period. In the weeks when supply rendezvous went smoothly, when weather was manageable, when Allied air coverage happened to be thin, when signals traffic stayed minimal, the wolf packs achieved results that seemed to vindicate the entire Type 14 concept. Extended patrols produced extended attrition of Allied shipping, but the vulnerability of the supply boats was structural, not circumstantial. No amount of tactical cleverness could fully compensate for the fundamental design trade-off that had produced vessels so slow and so surface-dependent. The milk cows were brilliant in concept and dangerously exposed in practice, and the spring and early summer of 1943 was the season in which that exposure began its inexorable transition from potential liability to realized catastrophe. By the time summer deepened and the tempo of Allied anti-submarine operations increased still further, the advantages that the Type 14 boats had delivered were being measured against costs that the Kriegsmarine had not budgeted for and could not easily absorb. Wolf packs were still operating at extended range, but the losses among both combat submarines and supply boats were climbing at a rate that eroded the strategic foundation beneath the entire campaign. Convoy commodores who had spent the spring requesting reinforcement were beginning to receive it, and the escorts that answered those requests came equipped with improved radar, better trained crews, and tactical doctrine that specifically targeted the refueling rendezvous as a point of maximum German vulnerability. The testing ground of spring had produced results on both sides, and the results were beginning to tell a story whose conclusion the Germans could not yet read clearly, but whose direction was becoming impossible to ignore. The milk cows had delivered their promise and begun to pay its price, and those two facts were now inseparable. By the middle of 1943, the German Naval Intelligence Service began receiving reports that troubled the High Command in ways their engineers had not anticipated. The Type 14 supply boats, those revolutionary milk cows that promised to reshape the entire Atlantic campaign, were no longer invisible. What had worked in theory and succeeded in the opening months of operation was now facing something far more dangerous than conventional anti-submarine escorts. They were facing an enemy that could see them coming. The Allies had discovered the supply boats, recognized their strategic value, and begun a systematic, methodical hunt that would define the final months of German submarine dominance in the Atlantic. This was not the work of a single brilliant strategist or a lucky encounter at sea. It was the convergence of multiple intelligence streams, technical innovations, and operational patience that would slowly strangle the logistical lifeline sustaining German wolf packs. The recognition of the Type 14 threat within Allied command structures evolved gradually but with increasing clarity. Naval intelligence officers in London and Washington noticed a pattern in U-boat behavior that diverged sharply from earlier campaigns. Combat submarines were remaining on station longer, staying aggressive for weeks beyond their normal operational radius, and undertaking offensive actions in distant waters where fuel consumption should have forced them to withdraw. The arithmetic was troubling to the Allies. Submarines were supposed to return home when their tanks ran dry, but these boats were not behaving according to established doctrine. Radio direction finding stations along the British coast and in North America began noting unusual concentrations of submarine radio traffic in specific ocean regions, signals that suggested rendezvous operations rather than the typical dispersed wolfpack communications. The puzzle pieces, once scattered, began forming a coherent picture. Someone in Berlin had found a way to extend the reach of the submarine fleet, and that someone, or rather, that something, had to be identified and neutralized. The breakthrough came from multiple sources working in parallel, each contributing a crucial fragment to the intelligence mosaic. Codebreakers working at Bletchley Park who could read the German naval Enigma cipher occasionally intercepted messages referring to supply operations and rendezvous coordinates. These were not the routine tactical signals. They contained references to supply transfers, fuel quantities, and timing information that revealed the existence of dedicated logistics vessels. Simultaneously, convoy commanders and escort captains filed reports about U-boat contacts that diverged from normal behavior. Skippers of Allied warships described seeing submarine contacts that moved slowly, heavily laden, and possessed unusual acoustic signatures. Merchant marine officers who had survived U-boat attacks spoke of unusual encounters with vessels that seemed to match no known German submarine class. The merchant sailors, some speaking quietly in debriefings, described seeing what appeared to be larger, more cumbersome boats operating among the wolf packs, boats that seemed to carry supplies rather than weapons. Piece by piece, the intelligence picture resolved itself into an unmistakable reality. Germany was operating a fleet of supply submarines. Once the Allies understood what they were hunting, the priority became operational. The Type 14 boats were not merely another class of U-boat, they were force multipliers of extraordinary strategic value. A single supply boat could extend the endurance of an entire wolf pack by weeks, effectively multiplying the combat power of the German submarine fleet without requiring any increase in production or personnel. The mathematics were obvious to every operational commander. If the supply boats could be eliminated, the entire German submarine campaign would suffer immediate and catastrophic degradation. The British and American navies began reallocating resources with a focus that would have seemed disproportionate if anyone had understood the full strategic weight of what they were targeting. Long-range consolidated patrol bombers, aircraft with the range to operate thousands of kilometers from their bases, began receiving new search patterns and targeting intelligence. These aircraft, capable of carrying depth charges and armed with increasingly sophisticated radar systems, started flying missions designed specifically to intercept submarines moving to and from supply rendezvous points. Escort carriers, those converted merchant vessels carrying a handful of fighters and anti-submarine aircraft, began positioning themselves along anticipated supply boat routes. The Allies were committing serious naval and air assets to the elimination of vessels that the German Navy had assumed would operate largely undetected. The communications that made the supply system work became its greatest vulnerability. Coordinating the movements of multiple submarines across thousands of kilometers of open ocean required radio messages, and radio messages, no matter how carefully encrypted, could be detected and analyzed. Every time a German commander transmitted coordinates for a refueling rendezvous, every time supply requirements were communicated from a wolf pack to a waiting milk cow, signals were broadcast into the electromagnetic spectrum, where British and American radio direction-finding networks waited to triangulate and locate. The Germans believed their Enigma cipher was unbreakable, yet the cryptographers at Bletchley Park read the signals with increasing regularity. The messages provided not just information about supply operations, but precise coordinates and timing data that Allied air and surface forces could act upon with remarkable speed. What had been encrypted communication became, in essence, a beacon drawing Allied forces to the exact location where supply boats would be vulnerable. The very sophistication of the German logistical system, with its reliance on coordinated radio traffic, created an intelligence vulnerability that the Allies were ruthlessly exploiting. The technological edge that the Allies possessed in 1943 extended far beyond simple radio direction finding. Allied radar systems, improving steadily throughout the war, could detect surfaced submarines at distances where the submarines could not yet see the attacking aircraft. Consolidated patrol bombers equipped with surface search radar could approach a supply boat in darkness or poor visibility, remaining undetected until they were directly overhead and ready to attack. These radar systems were still imperfect, still subject to false alarms and misidentification, yet they represented an overwhelming advantage over submarines that relied on lookouts peering through periscopes or surfaced watch officers scanning the horizon with their naked eyes. The Allies possessed another advantage: long-range escort aircraft that could provide coverage along shipping lanes and anticipated submarine transit routes. These aircraft, flying from bases in Ireland, Iceland, and North Africa, could remain on patrol for hours at a time, covering vast stretches of ocean that German submarines had previously crossed with reasonable confidence of remaining undetected. The combination of radar, direction finding, and coordinated patrol patterns created an increasingly hostile environment for any German submarine attempting to transit the Atlantic or establish rendezvous positions. By late summer of 1943, the first Type 14 boats began vanishing from German naval records. The submarines simply failed to return from patrol, their radio signals ceasing, their assigned supply missions going unfulfilled. The German Naval Command initially attributed these losses to conventional anti-submarine actions or bad luck in encountering particularly well-escorted convoys. However, as the losses accumulated and patterns emerged, a darker realization settled over the U-boat fleet command. The supply boats were being hunted specifically and systematically. Operational Type 14 submarines that had survived months of Atlantic patrol were being located and attacked with a precision that suggested the enemy knew where to look and when. This recognition provoked a fundamental strategic crisis. If the supply boats could not survive long enough to conduct their refueling missions, then the entire logistical foundation supporting the extended Atlantic campaign would collapse. The German naval staff faced a contradiction that engineering could not solve. The milk cows were essential to the U-boat campaign, yet they were being destroyed faster than they could conduct supply operations. The hunters had become the hunted, and the supply boats were being tracked with a professionalism that spoke to enormous Allied resources dedicated to their elimination. The response from German command came in the form of increasingly complex operational procedures designed to reduce the risk of detection. Supply rendezvous points were moved to more distant waters, routes were altered frequently, and communications security was further tightened with new encryption procedures and radio silence protocols. Commanding officers of supply boats received instructions to vary their transit patterns, to avoid predictable routes, and to remain submerged except when absolutely necessary. Yet every modification introduced delays and complications into the supply system that was already operating at the limits of its efficiency. Moving rendezvous points to more distant waters meant longer transits that consumed fuel, reducing the amount available for transfer to combat submarines. Increased security procedures meant slower communications and longer intervals between supply requests and supply deliveries. The defensive measures, well-intentioned and operationally sound in isolation, began to work against the fundamental purpose of the supply system itself. The game that was unfolding was one of escalating complexity, where each German action to increase security or improve survival rates subtly undermined the logistical effectiveness of the entire network. The Allies, meanwhile, continued to adapt and improve their hunting methods, matching German evasion tactics with better intelligence analysis, more precise direction finding, and closer coordination between air and surface forces. The human element of this technological and tactical struggle often remained invisible to the strategic planners making decisions in distant headquarters. The crews of Type 14 supply boats faced a unique and particularly terrible form of warfare. These men were not aboard vessels optimized for combat. They were aboard submarines designed to carry fuel, supplies, and ammunition for other boats. The very cargo that gave them purpose made them exceptionally vulnerable. A milk cow struck by a depth charge or aircraft-launched torpedo did not sink like a normal warship, it ignited. The fuel they carried, accumulated in tanks throughout their hull, transformed a single successful attack into a catastrophe of fire and explosion. Survivors in these circumstances faced not simple drowning, but burning oil and toxic fumes, deaths that were often more horrific than the straightforward violence of conventional naval combat. The commanding officers of these boats understood this reality with perfect clarity. They knew that their boats were being hunted, that the Allies were allocating significant resources to their elimination, and that their own survival rates were dropping with every week that passed. These men possessed the technical skill to navigate the Atlantic, to locate rendezvous coordinates, and to execute supply transfers in rough seas and dangerous waters. They also possessed the courage, or perhaps the fatalism, necessary to continue their missions even as the likelihood of completing them alive diminished with steady progression towards zero. The strategic situation at the end of 1943 had transformed into something approaching a Greek tragedy. The Type 14 supply boats had been conceived as a solution to an impossible problem: how to sustain an undersea campaign against a foe whose industrial capacity and technological advantages seemed insurmountable. For a few months in early 1943, the milk cows had appeared to offer an answer, an operational innovation that could extend German power at sea beyond its natural limits. Yet the very existence of the supply boats, once discovered, revealed their own critical vulnerability. They were slow, they were heavily laden, and they had to communicate to coordinate their essential function. These characteristics, unavoidable given the nature of their mission, made them perfect targets for an enemy possessing superior detection technology, more efficient fighting forces, and the resources to hunt them relentlessly. The Allies had not needed to defeat the Type 14 boats through some brilliant strategic counterstroke. They had simply needed to recognize their value, allocate sufficient resources to hunt them, and execute methodically until enough of them had been destroyed that the supply system could no longer function effectively. The hunting of the milk cows was not dramatic. It was grinding, systematic, and utterly effective. It represented the triumph, not of inspired innovation, but of accumulated technological and organizational advantage. The slow strangling of German naval power by an enemy with more ships, more aircraft, more personnel, and more capacity to sustain losses and continue fighting. By autumn 1943, the transformation was complete. The Type 14 supply boats, once viewed as harbingers of a new German maritime strategy, had become symbols of desperation rather than promise. They continued to operate, continued to attempt supply missions, continued to risk their crews in waters that had become increasingly dangerous. Yet the game was no longer uncertain in outcome. It had become a race between German efforts to keep the supply system functional and Allied efforts to destroy enough milk cows that the system would cease to matter. The eyes in the sky that Allied air forces could direct toward anticipated supply boat routes were not the only means of detection and pursuit, but they were perhaps the most visible and immediate threat. More fundamentally, the entire apparatus of Allied naval and air power, the radar, the direction finding, the coordinated patrols, the tactical doctrine, and the strategic will to allocate resources to this specific hunt, had turned the Atlantic into an environment where slow, defenseless supply submarines could no longer operate with any reasonable expectation of survival. The strategic environment that had allowed the milk cow concept to develop and operate successfully in the first half of 1943 had ceased to exist. The hunters had found their prey, understood its value, and begun the systematic work of extinction. The summer of 1943 arrived with the same Atlantic swells that had carried German submarines through years of commerce raiding. But the ocean itself had transformed into something far more hostile than weather alone could explain. The Type 14 supply boats, those revolutionary cargo carriers that had promised to extend the Kriegsmarine's reach indefinitely, now faced an enemy that had learned not just to detect them, but to prioritize their destruction above nearly all other targets. What had begun as a technical triumph, the marriage of submarine hull and logistics depot, was about to become a lesson in the brutal mathematics of modern warfare, where innovation without overwhelming force amounts to nothing more than a slow-motion tragedy. The first loss would not come as a shock to those who understood naval warfare, but rather as confirmation of a terrible reality that German command had perhaps underestimated. Submarines designed to carry supplies, rather than weapons, are submarines designed to die slowly. By the middle of 1943, Allied signals intelligence had begun to recognize patterns in German U-boat radio traffic that betrayed the presence and movements of supply boats. Direction-finding stations scattered across the Atlantic and at home ports in Britain intercepted transmissions coordinating rendezvous between hunter submarines and their floating depots. The very act of refueling at sea required communication, positions, timing, course adjustments, and every transmission became a beacon to listening ears, equipped with the latest detecting equipment. What the Germans had conceived as a brilliant solution to the problem of range had inadvertently created a new problem, It generated radio signatures that marked the supply boats as something different from ordinary combat submarines, something slower, something more valuable, something worth hunting. The Allies, particularly the British Naval Command and the American escort carrier task forces, had grasped this reality with remarkable speed and had begun to shift their anti-submarine efforts accordingly. The first Type 14 to fall to enemy action carried with it not merely a loss of vessel and crew, but a symbolic rupture in the German naval strategy. Whether this initial loss came to depth charges from a British escort corvette, to the deadly accuracy of a consolidated Catalina's depth bombs, or to the coordinated assault of a surface task force, the specific mechanism mattered far less than the fact of destruction itself. The milk cow, laden with its irreplaceable cargo of diesel fuel and supplies meant for submarines still operating against merchant convoys, sank into waters where no recovery was possible and no salvage could retrieve its lost cargo. The men aboard, whether they went down with the boat or survived briefly in water before succumbing to hypothermia and the indifference of the sea, became statistics in a campaign where the individual had long since ceased to matter. What mattered to German naval command was the operational reality. A Type 14 had been sunk, confirmed either through intercepted signals or through Allied reports gleaned from intelligence networks, and that loss cascaded through the carefully balanced logistics of the entire submarine campaign. The intelligence reaching German naval headquarters in the days and weeks following this first confirmed loss painted a picture of accelerating danger. Multiple reports arrived, suggesting that the Allies were no longer treating the Type 14 boats as ordinary submarines worthy of standard anti-submarine attention. Instead, these vessels had become priority targets. The reason was abundantly clear to any staff officer capable of strategic analysis. A single Type 14 represented the logistical equivalent of an entire Wolfpack's extended patrol. If a supply boat could be kept operational, it multiplied the effectiveness of 6 or 8 combat submarines by allowing them to remain on station for weeks longer than their fuel reserves would normally permit. Conversely, if the supply boats could be hunted down and destroyed, the entire Wolfpack system would collapse, not from lack of submarines, but from simple exhaustion of fuel reserves. The Allies had recognized this leverage point with the clarity that comes from desperation and superior intelligence, and they had begun to exploit it with systematic ruthlessness. Within the following months, autumn of 1943, the losses mounted with a frequency that transformed the Type 14 program from an innovation into a bleeding wound in the German naval structure. Each subsequent sinking followed patterns that revealed the effectiveness of Allied hunting methods. The supply boats were found not by accident but by design, intercepted not at random but according to predicted patrol routes and known rendezvous coordinates. The communications intelligence that allowed the Allies to read enough of German naval signals to anticipate movements transformed every Type 14 into a marked vessel from the moment it departed German ports. The slow speed that made these submarines so vulnerable to air attack, they could not dive quickly enough to escape a determined assault from above, became a catastrophic liability rather than merely an operational inconvenience. Commanding officers who had accepted the role of supply boat skipper faced not the hunter's excitement of seeking merchant vessels, but rather the hunted's desperation of knowing that enemy forces were actively searching for their position with increasingly sophisticated methods. The strategic implications of these losses penetrated quickly through German naval command, though the institutional response remained fragmented by conflicting priorities and the bureaucratic inertia that had plagued German military planning throughout the war. Some commanders argued that the supply boat concept remained sound but required better protection. Accordingly, they proposed assigning combat U-boats to escort duty, a solution that gutted the very purpose of having extended-range wolf packs. Others suggested that Type 14 boats should operate only in remote waters, the Caribbean, the waters off South America, the distant reaches of the South Atlantic, where Allied air patrols were less proficient and naval forces fewer. Still others, with a clarity born perhaps from watching the monthly reduction in available submarines, quietly acknowledged that the Type 14 program was becoming a dead weight, consuming scarce construction capacity and trained crews for vessels that the Allies were increasingly proficient at destroying. The tension between defending a strategic concept and acknowledging a tactical defeat created paralysis at precisely the moment when decisive action might have salvaged something from the deteriorating situation. The psychological impact on commanding officers and crews assigned to Type 14 boats cannot be overstated, though the historical record tends to compress such human dimensions into footnotes rather than narrative centers. A man assigned to captain a supply boat understood, either explicitly or through the accumulated knowledge of the submarine service, that he was joining a force that was being systematically hunted. The boat he commanded was slower than combat submarines, less maneuverable, and far more vulnerable. Its defensive armament, modest compared even to ordinary U-boats, was barely adequate to repel a determined air attack. If the boat was forced to dive quickly to escape assault, the weight and bulk of cargo could slow the descent dangerously, creating windows of vulnerability that determined attackers could exploit with ease. The crew understood that their boat's value to the larger campaign existed in inverse proportion to its value as a combat system. They were present to support others, and in that support lay both their duty and their doom. Some men accepted this assignment with professional equanimity. Others perhaps saw in it a kind of maritime death sentence, the slow probability of sinking becoming a certainty given sufficient time. The loss of multiple Type 14 boats across a span of months rather than years demonstrated that the Allies were not engaged in sporadic hunting, but rather in the systematic elimination of a known threat. Each sinking prompted strategic review and tactical adjustment from German command, but these responses typically arrived too late to protect the next vulnerable boat. By the time new procedures were implemented, deeper diving patterns, modified communication protocols, altered refueling locations, the Allies had already adapted their countermeasures and incorporated the lessons from previous successes. This cycle of measure and countermeasure, which should have been the dynamic of a roughly balanced competition, instead played out as a ratcheting process of escalating efficiency on the Allied side and mounting desperation on the German side. The supply boats had transformed the submarine war only temporarily. Now they were becoming monuments to the gap between German innovation and German resources, between clever conception and the overwhelming force that could simply destroy what could not outrun or outfight. The broader realization that spread through German naval command with each confirmed loss was both simple and catastrophic. The Type 14 program had created not a new strategic capability, but rather a new vulnerability. The supply boats, because of their value, had become magnetic targets for Allied forces. Their presence in the Atlantic could be inferred from the continued effectiveness of German wolf packs, and that continued effectiveness made locating the supply boats a strategic priority of the highest order. Furthermore, the supply boats' very success in extending wolf pack range meant that those wolf packs were pressing further into waters where Allied air power was more concentrated and Allied naval forces more proficient at coordinated tactics. The wolves that the milk cows fed were themselves increasingly visible and vulnerable. The extended operational range that was supposed to give Germany an advantage instead distributed German submarines across a wider area where they could be hunted more easily. The elegance of the solution collapsed under the weight of realities that theoretical planning in German shipyards and naval ministry offices had not adequately addressed. By the autumn of 1943, the cumulative effect of losses was becoming unmistakable in operational statistics and in the strategic mood at German naval headquarters. The number of Type 14 boats available for deployment was declining month by month, not replaced at the rate originally envisioned, because new construction could not keep pace with losses, and because the damage inflicted by air raids on German shipyards was accelerating. Each lost boat represented months of construction effort, specialized equipment that could not be easily replaced, and trained crews whose knowledge and experience died with them. The supply boat fleet, which had numbered in the low double digits at its operational peak, was shrinking towards single figures, then toward a handful of survivors, then toward a rearguard of final boats attempting to conduct missions in an increasingly hostile environment. The strategic vision that had animated the Type 14 program, sustaining the U-boat war indefinitely through extended range and seagoing supply depots, was collapsing not because the concept was inherently flawed, but because the Allies had recognized its critical importance and had devoted sufficient resources to systematically destroying it. The human cost of this realization fell not only on commanding officers and crews of the supply boats themselves, but also on the commanders of the wolf packs they served. A submarine captain who was relying on a planned rendezvous with a Type 14 for fuel and supplies faced an increasing probability that the supply boat would not appear at the designated time and place. Whether the boat had been sunk, damaged, forced to divert, or lost to communication failure, the practical effect was identical. The hunting wolf was deprived of sustenance, forced to choose between attempting the passage home on insufficient fuel or attempting to hunt with reserves that should have been preserved for emergency. Some captains conducted desperate searches for supply boats that no longer existed, wasting precious fuel in futile attempts to make contact. Others turned toward the nearest Axis port, whether in occupied France, in Spain, or in Portugal, hoping that neutral ports or German bases could provide minimal refueling and supplies. The interconnected system that had promised to sustain the entire U-boat campaign was fractioning into isolated nodes of desperation, each boat increasingly aware that the logistical network that had appeared so promising in early 1943 was ceasing to function. The first losses of Type 14 boats, when examined not in isolation but as the opening movement of an accelerating series of destructions, revealed a fundamental asymmetry in the naval war that German strategic planners had perhaps hoped to overcome through innovation. The Allies could afford to lose some escorts and some patrol aircraft in the process of hunting supply boats. The loss was acceptable because each supply boat destroyed prevented the loss of many times that value in merchant shipping to German wolves operating at extended range. The Germans, by contrast, could not afford to lose supply boats because they could not be easily replaced and because each loss multiplied the pressure on remaining boats. Attrition was a game that the Allies won through sheer numerical superiority and productive capacity. Innovation was a German response to scarcity, but when the innovation itself became scarce, the strategy that had depended upon it ceased to function. The first Type 14 that sank into the Atlantic in 1943 was not merely a single loss, but rather the visible beginning of a cascade of failures that would, by the end of 1944, reduce the milk cow fleet to almost nothing. By the autumn of 1943, The hunters had begun closing in on the hunters. Allied escort vessels, equipped with improved radar and directed by signals intelligence, began positioning themselves along the known routes where Type 14 supply boats conducted their rendezvous operations with wolf packs. The very sophistication that made the milk cows operationally necessary, their size, their slow speed, their predictable patrol patterns designed to meet multiple submarines across weeks of Atlantic deployment, became the signature that betrayed them. German Naval Command faced a crisis that no engineer could solve with better hull design or faster engines. The supply boats were being stalked, and their destruction was no longer a matter of chance, but of systematic priority. The Allies understood what the Germans had discovered months earlier, that cutting off the logistical backbone of the U-boat offensive might accomplish what direct combat had not: the collapse of the Atlantic campaign. The solution that emerged from German naval headquarters seemed logical in theory, even elegant in its simplicity. If Type 14 supply boats were vulnerable to attack, then they must be protected. If combat submarines could not spare fuel and torpedoes to be at risk, then other vessels would provide the shield. German planners ordered the assignment of escort vessels, minesweepers, torpedo boats, and armed trawlers to accompany milk cows on portions of their Atlantic transit. These escorts were not warships designed for fleet action, but rather small, fast vessels that could respond to aircraft or surface threats with their own weaponry and maneuverability. On paper, the arrangement promised to solve the vulnerability problem. The supply boat would proceed under armed protection, deliver its cargo, and return to port with the loss rate reduced to acceptable levels. What German command failed to account for was that the Atlantic in 1943 was no longer a theatre where small-scale protection measures sufficed. The Allies did not send one or two escort vessels against a German convoy. They sent coordinated task forces with multiple layers of detection and engagement capability. But the most controversial and operationally consequential decision was the assignment of combat U-boats as guardians to the supply boats. This step represented a paradox so acute that it would ultimately undermine the entire supply boat concept. A combat submarine, a Type Visic or Type XIV U-boat carrying a full complement of 14 to 24 torpedoes, equipped for extended patrol and offensive action, would be detached from wolf-pack operations and assigned to shadow a milk cow. The combat submarine would remain submerged in the vicinity of the supply boat's position, ready to engage any Allied vessel that approached. The logic was operationally sound. A U-boat torpedo, if properly placed, could sink or cripple an enemy escort before it reached the vulnerable supply boat. Yet this logic depended on assumptions that reality had already disproven. Allied convoys and hunter-killer groups moved with such speed and coordination that a submerged submarine often detected the threat too late to achieve a decisive intercept. The patrol aircraft that increasingly dominated the Atlantic by late 1943 operated at ranges and altitudes that rendered a waiting submarine nearly irrelevant to the defense. The deeper paradox emerged when German command attempted to calculate the strategic mathematics of this arrangement. A Type Vic U-boat consumed resources: construction time, skilled crew training, scarce fuel, valuable torpedoes. When that boat was pulled from independent wolf-pack operations to serve as a guardian to a single supply boat, Germany was trading active predator for static protector. Over the course of months, a single combat U-boat assigned to guard a milk cow was therefore unavailable to sink Allied merchant vessels, which meant its presence as a guardian was eliminating the very offensive capability that the supply boat was intended to sustain. If a Type XIV on independent patrol could be expected to sink 8 or 10 merchant ships during a 60-day cruise, then pulling that boat from the hunt to protect a supply boat meant accepting a strategic loss of 8 or 10 ships' worth of tonnage to prevent the loss of a single supply vessel. The mathematics were brutal, and they revealed an uncomfortable truth. The more the Germans attempted to protect their supply boats, the less strategic value those boats provided. The protection had become nearly as costly as the loss it prevented. This dilemma manifested in concrete operational terms throughout the autumn and winter of 1943. German commanders in the field faced impossible decisions when receiving orders to protect a designated milk cow. A U-boat captain would be ordered to rendezvous with a supply boat at a specific coordinate, maintain position in the vicinity, and provide defensive support. Yet the very act of maintaining station exposed the submarine to detection. The communication signals used to coordinate the rendezvous operated at frequencies that Allied direction-finding equipment had learned to intercept and locate. The prescribed patrol area often lay within the operational radius of Allied aircraft based in Iceland, the Azores, or recently occupied North African airfields. German commanders knew that their presence as protectors was in many cases an invitation to the enemy to attack multiple targets simultaneously rather than a genuine defense. Some captains attempted to fulfill their escort duties by remaining in the area. Others, recognizing the trap, departed at higher speeds to increase the temporal gap between the time of intercept and the time of attack, thereby reducing their chance of mutual annihilation. This tension between operational orders and tactical reality fractured German command's capacity to execute a coherent strategy. The few engagements that did occur when combat U-boats attempted to defend supply boats demonstrated both the promise and the futility of the arrangement. In several documented instances, a combat U-boat succeeded in detecting an approaching threat and maneuvering to intercept or disrupt it. The presence of a German submarine torpedo in the water, even if it missed its target, forced Allied escort vessels to take evasive action, breaking their attack formation and reducing their coordination with aircraft support. Yet these tactical successes occurred in isolation from the broader strategic picture. The loss of a single Allied escort vessel, while tactically significant, did nothing to prevent the sinking of the milk cow in question. More commonly, the engagement sequence unfolded differently. The Allied hunter-killer group detected both the supply boat and its guardian simultaneously, attacked both targets, and inflicted damage that often proved fatal to the larger and more valuable supply boat, while the combat U-boat dove and escaped. The Guardian had failed not because of lack of will or courage, but because the tactical environment had evolved beyond the capacity of single submarines to influence outcomes. German naval planners in Berlin, observing the loss rate of supply boats and the reports arriving from commanders in the field, found themselves trapped in a narrowing corridor of options. If they withdrew the combat submarine Guardians and reassigned boats to offensive Wolfpack operations, the supply boats would become even more vulnerable and the loss rate would accelerate. Yet if they maintained the Guardian assignments, they were accepting a structural reduction in offensive capability that undermined the entire purpose of the supply boat program. Some officers advocated for a third option: increase the number of escort vessels assigned to milk cows, sending not a single minesweeper or armed trawler, but rather small task forces of 3 or 4 escort vessels per supply boat. This proposal was rejected on grounds of practicality. Germany lacked sufficient escort vessels to simultaneously protect supply boats, defend its own harbours against increasing Allied air attack, and maintain any presence in the English Channel and North Sea. The shortage was not a temporary supply problem but rather a structural consequence of Germany's inability to maintain shipbuilding capacity across multiple categories of vessels while simultaneously sustaining losses to enemy action. The tension between the original conception of the Type 14, a modest, relatively undefended logistics vessel that would slip into the Atlantic, deliver supplies, and slip back to port, and its actual operational employment as a critical asset requiring layers of protection, revealed a fundamental miscalculation in German strategic planning. The milk cows had been designed with the assumption that the Atlantic would remain contested but not controlled by the Allies. The designers had anticipated that Allied air and surface forces would be present, but not omnipresent, that refueling operations could be conducted with reasonable risk, that a supply boat could operate with minimal armament, because defensive measures would not prove necessary. By the time the first Type 14s entered service in 1943, however, the Atlantic was transitioning from contested to dominated. Allied air patrols had expanded in range and frequency. Convoys moved under protection so effective that wolf packs required multiple submarines and sustained attacks to inflict losses. The supply boats that were intended to sustain this level of combat were now themselves requiring protection from threats that had not existed in the planning stages. The issue of crew morale emerged alongside the tactical problems. The men who served aboard Type XIV U-boats volunteered for service knowing that their vessels carried fuel and supplies rather than offensive weapons, understanding that their mission was to sustain others' combats rather than engage in combat themselves. Yet as the losses mounted and protection measures multiplied, the moral mathematics changed. Sailors aboard a milk cow now faced the knowledge that their vessel was marked for priority destruction by the Allies, that it would be hunted with exceptional intensity, that it carried cargo that would burn explosively if the hull was penetrated. At the same time, they understood that combat submarines assigned to protect them were being pulled from campaigns that those crews viewed as the true work of the submarine service. Resentment began to creep into communications between boat commanders and their crews. Some sailors aboard combat U-boats questioned why they were spending weeks in defensive patrol rather than hunting merchant ships. Some aboard supply boats wondered if they were being used as bait, their presence as an objective drawing enemy forces that would otherwise be dispersed across the Atlantic. These tensions did not rise to the level of mutiny or refusal of orders, but they represented a psychological fracture in the operational cohesion that German submarine crews had maintained through years of intensifying pressure. The broader context of Germany's strategic deterioration in late 1943 meant that the escort dilemma was not being resolved in isolation, but rather within a cascading series of operational failures. German surface ships, which might have provided more effective protection to supply boats than small escorts or Guardian U-boats, were themselves increasingly confined to port by the expanding reach of Allied air power. The German surface fleet that had once been expected to support Atlantic operations was now focused on defending itself against attack. Capital ships and cruisers that might have served as distant protection for supply boat operations were being retained for fleet battles that seemed increasingly unlikely to occur. The integration of German escort vessels into a unified defensive system was hampered by the competing demands of harbour defence, channel patrol, and the protection of other convoys carrying raw materials from occupied territories. German Naval Command could not spare resources to solve the supply boat protection problem because those same resources were required to address multiple other crises simultaneously. As autumn turned to winter in 1943, German naval headquarters accepted what field commanders had begun to understand. The protection of Type 14 supply boats could not be achieved through the measures available. The losses continued to mount. Each milk cow that was sunk represented not merely the loss of a vessel, but the loss of supplies that dependent wolf packs would never receive. The loss of fuel that would have extended the war by weeks or months. The loss of torpedoes that would have sunk additional merchant ships. The very existence of the supply boat program now demanded that resources be devoted to their protection, and those resources, when devoted to protection, meant fewer resources devoted to the offensive mission that the supply boats had been designed to sustain. German command was caught in a vortex of diminishing returns, where each attempt to solve the vulnerability problem only deepened the structural contradictions of their naval strategy. The supply boats had been conceived as a means of extending the war. They were becoming instead a symbol of Germany's inability to overcome the mathematics of superior Allied production and operational effectiveness, even through tactical innovation. The unresolved escort dilemma would remain unresolved precisely because it was not truly a tactical problem that tactics could solve. It was instead a manifestation of Germany's fundamental strategic weakness: insufficient resources to conduct simultaneous offense and defense across the Atlantic, insufficient construction capacity to replace losses faster than they accumulated, insufficient air capability to defend ships at sea because aircraft production was being prioritized for air defense at home. The attempt to protect Type 14 supply boats through combat submarine guardians represented a last resort, a hope that one limited resource, the trained submarine crews and boats, could somehow be stretched to accomplish two incompatible missions. That hope, in the end, only depleted the one resource that was already running dangerously low. By the time the winter of 1943 gave way to spring 1944, German naval commanders understood that the escort dilemma had been resolved not through planning, but through attrition. The supply boats would be protected less by Guardian submarines and more by the sheer reduction in numbers of both supply boats and the combat U-boats that might have guarded them. The milk cows would continue to operate, but with less protection, fewer allies, and an accelerating trajectory toward obsolescence. By the autumn of 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become something Germany's naval planners no longer recognized. What had been a theater of German dominance just months earlier transformed into a graveyard. The U-boat arm, which once prowled the shipping lanes with near impunity, now faced an enemy so comprehensively superior that survival itself had become the sole objective. The cumulative effect of Allied technological advancement, strategic coordination, and industrial output converged upon the submarine fleet with a force that no amount of tactical ingenuity could withstand. The Type 14 supply boats, those floating fuel depots that had promised to revolutionize German submarine strategy, suddenly became targets of a magnitude their designers had never anticipated. What had begun as hope in the spring now manifested as crisis by October. The mathematics of attrition had shifted decisively. Germany was losing submarines faster than it could build them, and the loss of each Type 14 represented not merely a vessel, but the operational infrastructure that sustained an entire strategy. The transformation of Allied anti-submarine warfare in 1943 was systematic and ruthless. The British and American navies had pooled their technological innovations, intelligence capabilities, and tactical doctrines into a unified apparatus for destroying German submarines. Where once a U-boat might evade detection through depth and silence, now the Allies possessed radar sets capable of penetrating darkness and detecting the smallest periscope. Centimetric radar, fitted to escort vessels and long-range maritime patrol aircraft, could locate a submarine on the surface at distances that made evasion impossible. The German Navy's vaunted U-boat crews discovered that their historic advantage, the ability to hunt unseen, had evaporated. Direction-finding equipment, refined through months of systematic development, could locate a U-boat transmitting a radio message within minutes. The very communications that allowed German commanders to coordinate Wolfpack attacks and arrange supply rendezvous became electronic beacons that led Allied hunters directly to their prey. This was not improvisation. This was industrial-scale technological warfare, and Germany was falling behind with accelerating velocity. The depth charge itself had evolved into a far more lethal instrument than the clumsy anti-submarine weapons of earlier years. British and American engineers had refined the patterns of deployment, improved the trigger mechanisms, and increased the explosive yield until the depth charge became capable of destroying a submarine at greater distances and with more certainty than ever before. The Hedgehog, a forward-firing anti-submarine mortar, allowed escort vessels to attack a submarine ahead of their own position, eliminating the traditional advantage that came from a U-boat detecting the noise of an approaching ship and evading downward into the depths. Coordinated attacks by multiple escorts, guided by radar and radio communication, meant that a U-boat surfacing to recharge batteries faced near-certain destruction. The crew of a Type 7 or Type X U-boat understood that each time they came to the surface, they were gambling with their lives against machines and tactics that grew more sophisticated with each passing week. The margin for error had become infinitesimal, and the penalty for miscalculation was invariably death. What distinguished the autumn of 1943 from earlier periods of the Atlantic campaign was not the arrival of any single weapon or technique, but rather their integration into a comprehensive system. Convoy escort forces had grown to include dedicated escort carriers equipped with aircraft capable of delivering depth charges or acoustic homing torpedoes, land-based aircraft with sufficient range to cover the mid-Atlantic gap, that expanse of ocean beyond the reach of shorter-range planes from either Europe or North America, now patrolled these waters continuously. The escort groups themselves had become proficient through repeated engagement, their crews trained to work in perfect coordination, their commanding officers understanding the behavior and vulnerabilities of German submarines with the precision that comes only from bitter experience. Allied cryptographers, working in the intelligence facilities at Bletchley Park and other locations, provided critical information about German submarine dispositions and movements, though this intelligence advantage had to be handled with extreme care to avoid revealing to the Germans that their radio codes had been compromised. The result was an apparatus of such overwhelming superiority that the old tactics of the Wolfpack became suicide missions. German commanders who sent their crews on patrols in the autumn of 1943 were sending many of them to almost certain death, and they knew it. The Type 14 boats occupied a particularly vulnerable position within this transformed Atlantic environment. These supply vessels were slower than combat submarines, capable of perhaps 12 knots at maximum speed when submerged, compared to the 17 knots that a Type NXC could achieve. More critically, a Type 14 was heavier, bulkier, and more difficult to maneuver than a conventional U-boat. Its hull was specifically designed to accommodate vast quantities of fuel oil, fresh water, ammunition, and food supplies, not to achieve speed or evasive capability. When Allied forces detected a Type 14 on radar, the supply boat had precious few options for escape. It could not outrun a surface escort. It could not dive as quickly as a combat submarine. Its defensive armament, typically light machine guns and perhaps a few anti-aircraft cannons, was almost useless against coordinated air attack. These vessels had been designed with the assumption that German submarines would maintain sufficient control of the Atlantic to allow supply boats to operate with relative security. By the autumn of 1943, this assumption had become lethally false. The milk cows were not merely vulnerable, they were fatally exposed, and the German Naval Command was only gradually accepting the reality of this vulnerability. The early autumn of 1943 saw several Type 14 boats attempt refueling operations that resulted in encounters with Allied forces. Each engagement reinforced the grim truth. The supply boats were being hunted with methodical precision. A Type 14 attempting to rendezvous with combat submarines could not evade without abandoning the resupply mission that constituted its entire operational purpose. If it chose to fight, its defensive capabilities were so inadequate that any serious air or surface attack would likely result in its destruction. If it attempted to dive and hide, it was abandoning the submarines that depended on fuel and supplies for their survival. The rendezvous coordinates, transmitted by radio and potentially intercepted by Allied intelligence, became in effect coordinates for Allied forces to anticipate German submarine movements. The very mechanism that allowed the German Navy to extend its operational reach in the Atlantic had transformed into a tool of its own destruction. Command planners at German naval headquarters in Berlin began to comprehend, however reluctantly, that the Type 14 program had created not a solution, but rather a strategic vulnerability. The sinking rates accelerated through September and October in ways that could not be explained away or rationalized. German submarine losses in the Atlantic reached levels that made replacement impossible. The shipyards, working at maximum capacity, could construct perhaps 10 new U-boats each month. But German forces were losing 15 or more vessels weekly. The mathematics were catastrophic. Within weeks, the inventory of operational submarines would contract to levels at which maintaining any presence in the Atlantic became impossible. Among the casualties were an increasing number of Type 14 boats. The loss of each supply boat eliminated the logistical capacity to support multiple combat submarines, creating a cascading failure throughout the entire supply network. Commanding officers received orders to attempt supply deliveries in conditions that made success increasingly unlikely, because the alternative was the complete cessation of Atlantic operations. Some crews understood that they were being sent on missions from which they would not return, yet they went, because refusal was not an option in the German Navy of 1943. The impact on morale within the U-boat arm was psychologically devastating. The crews of German submarines had always understood the risks inherent in their service, but they had operated during periods when successful patrols returned home, with stories of merchantmen sunk and convoys scattered. By the autumn of 1943, successful patrols were patrols from which the crew returned alive, a qualification that could no longer be assumed. The Type 14 crews faced particular terror because they knew their vessels were slower, larger, and more conspicuous than any combat submarine. Assignment to a Type 14 flotilla was understood to be a death sentence with a question only of timing. The legendary morale of the U-boat arm, its esprit de corps and determination, began to fracture under the weight of cumulative losses and mounting desperation. Men who had volunteered for submarine service in 1941 or 1942, when the Reich seemed ascendant and the future seemed limitless, now endured 1943, facing an enemy that possessed technologies, tactics, and resources they could not match. The transformation of the Atlantic from a domain of German military operation into a region of systematic Allied dominance occurred with brutal swiftness. The strategic calculation that had produced the Type 14 program, The belief that extending submarine operations would extend the war against commerce indefinitely collapsed under the pressure of the autumn of 1943. The supply boats had extended German submarine endurance, but this extension had occurred in a theatre where every additional week of operations meant exposure to enemies that grew more lethal with each passing day. The innovation was not flawed in concept, but it had been born from a fundamental misunderstanding of the trajectory of the war. German planners in 1942, when the Type 14 was still in the design phase, had assumed that German technology and tactics would continue to improve, that the submarine arm would continue to inflict losses on Allied shipping, and that the cumulative pressure would eventually force a negotiated peace. They had not anticipated that the Allies would solve the anti-submarine problem so completely and so quickly. They had not understood that once the technological tide turned, it would turn irreversibly. The milk cows, conceived as instruments of strategic victory, became monuments to strategic miscalculation. By November 1943, the situation had become so dire that German Naval Command made the decision to temporarily withdraw the main body of U-boats from the Atlantic. This withdrawal was not an admission of defeat. Such admissions were impossible in Nazi Germany, but rather a recognition that operational conditions had become unsustainable. German submarines would continue to conduct patrols, but the concentration of forces that had characterized the Wolfpack operations of 1941 and early 1942 would not resume. The Type 14 supply boats, which had been specifically designed to sustain exactly this kind of intensive campaign, found themselves without a purpose. There were fewer combat submarines operating in the Atlantic, which meant fewer supply deliveries were needed. The boats that remained in operation could often reach distant patrol areas only to discover that the submarines they were meant to resupply had themselves been sunk. The milk cows became vessels searching for prey that no longer existed in the numbers that justified their existence. Some Type 14s were hastily reassigned to different tasks. Others remained in port or undertook patrols that were less about supporting the Atlantic campaign and more about simply maintaining the appearance of German naval activity. The logistical innovation that had promised to sustain the Atlantic campaign collapsed not because of any flaw in its conception or execution, but because it had been predicated on assumptions about the broader war that proved catastrophically wrong. The Type 14 supply boats had extended German submarine operations by weeks or months, allowing wolf packs to remain on station when they might otherwise have been forced to withdraw for refueling. Yet these extensions occurred in a theatre that had undergone a transformation so complete that extended operations meant only extended exposure to superior enemy forces. The supply boats had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had delivered fuel and supplies to combat submarines. But they could not deliver what no shipyard could produce: technological superiority, strategic clarity, or the ability to reverse a tide of war that had turned decisively against Germany. By the autumn of 1943, the milk cows and the submarines they were meant to sustain had become prisoners of a strategy that no longer had any possibility of success. The transformation of the Atlantic from a German-dominated theatre to an Allied-dominated one had occurred with such speed and finality that even the most innovative logistical solutions could do nothing but delay the inevitable. By the autumn of 1943, the German Naval Command faced a crisis that no amount of defensive optimism could obscure. The Type 14 supply boats, which had promised to sustain wolf packs across thousands of kilometers of ocean, were themselves becoming targets of systematic and increasingly effective Allied hunting. Every month brought news of another milk cow sunk, another supply mission aborted, another precious resource lost to the bottom of the Atlantic. The architects of this logistical innovation, the engineers at the shipyards, the admirals in their Berlin offices, the commanding officers at sea, recognized that their strategy required not acceptance of defeat, but desperate and creative adaptation. If the enemy had learned to hunt the supply boats, then German design and tactics must evolve faster than Allied countermeasures could adapt. It was a race against time, and everyone involved understood that time itself had become Germany's scarcest resource. The technical modifications began in earnest during the closing months of 1943. German engineers at the major shipyards understood that the Type 14's vulnerability stemmed from multiple compounding weaknesses. The boat was large and relatively slow, which made it an easy target for aircraft equipped with improved radar. Its hull, designed to accommodate vast cargo capacity, lacked the structural reinforcement that would permit deeper diving, a critical defensive capability now that Allied depth charges and underwater detection equipment had become far more sophisticated. Naval architects proposed modifications that attempted to address these deficiencies, thickening certain sections of the hull to permit diving to greater depths, redesigning ballast tank configurations to improve both defensive maneuverability and cargo stability, and even experimenting with alternative hull shapes that might reduce the radar cross-section visible to Allied detection equipment. Yet each modification represented a careful compromise. Making the hull stronger meant reducing cargo space. Improving speed required sacrificing fuel capacity. Every structural change demanded time and resources that dwindled with each passing week of the war. One significant technical initiative focused on improving the defensive armament carried by Type 14 boats. The original design included modest defensive weapons, some twin 20mm anti-aircraft guns, and perhaps a single 37mm cannon. These weapons had proven entirely inadequate against determined aircraft attacks or surface escorts equipped with modern naval gunnery systems. Engineers proposed mounting additional 20mm guns, experimenting with quadruple anti-aircraft mountings similar to those fitted to larger surface warships, and even exploring the installation of automated gun systems that might track and engage targets faster than manual crews could manage. The goal was ambitious: transform the milk cows from nearly defenseless targets into vessels capable of fighting their way through air and surface opposition. Yet the weight of additional armor and weaponry further compromised the boat's already marginal performance characteristics. A Type 14 burdened with extensive defensive armament would dive more slowly, maintain shallower maximum depths, and carry proportionally less fuel and supplies, the very cargo that justified its existence. The modifications extended beyond mere hardware changes into the operational and tactical realm. German commanders at sea began implementing new procedures designed to mask the movements and communications of supply boats. Refueling rendezvous were conducted at increasingly unconventional locations, far from the predictable convoy routes where Allied detection networks had grown most proficient. Operations that had previously centered on the central Atlantic, where German wolf packs had inflicted their heaviest damage on Allied shipping, shifted toward more distant waters, where Allied air cover remained sparse or intermittent. The Caribbean Sea became a focus of expanded German submarine operations, its warm waters and numerous island anchorages offering opportunities for supply operations conducted under the cover of tropical cloud formations and at distances that stretched even Allied patrol aircraft to the limits of their endurance. The Indian Ocean, separated from the main European theatre by the vast distances of the South Atlantic and the waters around the Cape of Good Hope, presented similar strategic attractions. Here German raiders and supply boats could potentially sustain independent operations far from the centers of Allied strength. Implementation of these distant operations revealed both opportunities and new vulnerabilities. A Type 14 refueling a combat U-boat off the coast of Brazil or in the waters west of Africa operated beyond the normal reach of the most heavily concentrated Allied anti-submarine forces. Supply operations in these remote theaters could extend for longer periods without interruption, and the vast distances involved provided natural concealment that no amount of radar sophistication could overcome. German command authorized experimental supply missions to the Caribbean and South Atlantic, and initial results suggested that the strategy held merit. Combat submarines refueled in these distant waters could extend their patrols toward shipping lanes that had previously lain beyond their operational range, and the psychological impact on Allied merchant captains, suddenly discovering German submarines attacking commerce so far from the European theatre, provided a propaganda value that compensated for the actual tonnages sunk. Yet the logistical requirements for maintaining operations across such distances were staggering. Supply boats themselves required extraordinary endurance to reach these remote waters, and each long voyage consumed fuel that might otherwise have been transferred to combat submarines. The communications required to coordinate these increasingly complex and dispersed operations created their own intelligence vulnerabilities. German command had never fully appreciated the sophistication of Allied signals intelligence or the systematic manner in which direction-finding equipment could locate U-boats by triangulating their radio transmissions. As supply boats and their assigned wolf packs attempted to coordinate rendezvous in distant waters, the very radio messages that made such coordination possible also created electronic signatures that Allied intelligence networks had become expert at detecting. The precise course changes, the carefully calculated meeting times, the delivery quantities and frequencies, all of these operational details existed only as encoded radio traffic, and the Allies had made formidable progress in both intercepting and decoding these messages. German command remained unaware of the full scope of this intelligence penetration, continuing to assume that the Kriegsmarine's Enigma encryption remained secure even after the British had achieved regular success in breaking naval Enigma traffic. This security blindness would persist throughout the final year of the war, with potentially catastrophic consequences for supply boats whose movements became increasingly transparent to enemy commanders, despite layers of encryption and operational security measures. The human dimension of adaptation proved as significant as any technical modification or tactical adjustment. Commanding officers assigned to Type 14 boats understood that they had accepted posts at the apex of German naval danger. A milk cow was not a prestige command, it was a death sentence with paperwork. Yet from these men came innovations born of necessity and desperation. They experimented with deceptive tactics, sailing on calculated courses designed to confuse enemy direction-finding equipment, maintaining radio silence for extended periods, using weather patterns and seasonal cloud cover to mask their movements. Some commanding officers attempted to navigate in the depths of the water column rather than remaining on the surface to charge batteries and circulate fresh air, accepting the discomfort and danger of prolonged submerged operations in exchange for reduced detection probability. Others coordinated with combat U-boats to create deceptive radio traffic, false messages sent from random locations to confuse Allied intelligence about where supply operations were actually occurring. These innovations reflected the resourcefulness of experienced naval officers, yet they also demonstrated a certain tragic futility. An enemy that could locate U-boats by radar, direction finding, and visual sighting from aircraft could not be significantly disadvantaged by radio deception alone. The resource constraints that governed German naval operations during this period rendered many proposed modifications theoretical exercises rather than practical improvements. The shipyards that might have implemented hull strengthening or new ballast configurations were themselves under increasing pressure from Allied bombing campaigns. Raw materials, steel, copper, specialized alloys, were becoming scarce as German industry struggled to maintain production across multiple weapons programs competing for the same finite resources. The modification of existing Type 14 boats competed with orders for new construction, and the new construction programs themselves were being scaled back as German planners gradually accepted that the age of submarine expansion had ended. Some proposed improvements were tested on a small number of boats, while others never progressed beyond the design stage. The dream of creating a faster, deeper diving, better armed milk cow remained largely unfulfilled, another casualty of Germany's inability to generate the industrial capacity required to match the scope of its strategic ambitions. The shift of supply operations toward remote theaters created unexpected complications for German garrisons and isolated forces operating in distant regions. German naval presence in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans had always depended on supply boats for fuel, ammunition, and food sufficient to maintain operations far from German-controlled ports. As Type 14 casualties mounted and operational boats became scarcer, German command faced impossible choices about resource allocation. Should available supply boats service the remaining wolf packs operating in the central Atlantic, where the potential for merchant shipping destruction remained highest, or should supplies be diverted to support German surface raiders, isolated garrisons in the Atlantic islands, or experimental operations in the Indian Ocean? These decisions reflected no coherent strategy, but rather a desperate attempt to maintain multiple unsustainable operations with insufficient assets. Some commanding officers found themselves ordered to deliver supplies to locations where no receiving submarines materialized, their cargo wasted in waters where the enemy had already achieved dominance. The German naval leadership confronted a painful reality by early 1944. The modifications and tactical adjustments, though executed with professional competence and considerable ingenuity, could not alter the fundamental mathematical imbalance that governed the Battle of the Atlantic. Every innovation required time to develop, test, and implement. Time that was consumed by accelerating Allied advances in detection technology, air cover density, and anti-submarine coordination. For every technical improvement made to Type 14 boats, the Allies deployed 3 new technological countermeasures. For every new tactic developed by German commanders, the Allies adapted their search patterns and engagement procedures within weeks. The milk cow program had been born from recognition that logistics determine operational capacity, yet the same principle now applied in reverse. The Allies possessed such overwhelming logistical superiority that German innovations could only slow, never reverse, the tide of attrition. The human cost of these adaptive efforts extended beyond operational casualties to include the psychological burden borne by crews assigned to supply boats. These men understood, with increasing clarity as 1943 gave way to 1944, that they were serving in a doomed enterprise. The innovations and modifications represented the visible expression of German desperation. Each new defensive weapon or tactical adjustment, a tacit acknowledgement that the previous measures had proven insufficient. Crews of Type 14 boats saw sister ships disappear into the Atlantic with horrifying regularity. They knew that fuel and supplies destined for their cargo holds would never reach their intended recipients because the combat submarines that should have received them had been sunk. They understood that refueling rendezvous coordinates represented not logistical efficiency, but rather a likely appointment with an enemy that grew more proficient at killing each passing month. The adaptations continued because German military culture demanded the attempt, because giving up was philosophically unthinkable, because somewhere in the upper levels of naval command there remained the faint hope that one more innovation might prove the difference. Yet among the officers and men who actually captained these vessels and served aboard them, a grimmer awareness took hold. Adaptation was becoming another word for prolonging the inevitable. The calendar turns to 1944, and the Atlantic has become a furnace. What remains of Germany's Type 14 supply boat fleet operates not in the shroud of strategic ambition anymore, but in the grip of raw survival. The ports from which these vessels depart, Bremen, Hamburg, Kiel, the French Atlantic bases still clinging to German control, are themselves battlegrounds. American and British bombers rain destruction on shipyards and docks in relentless day and night raids. A milk cow preparing for departure does not slip quietly to sea as it once did. Instead, commanding officers time their sorties between air raid warnings, sometimes departing under bombardment, their hulls marked with fresh damage before they even reach open water. The crews understand what this means. They are not voyaging towards supply rendezvous with wolf packs in distant waters. They are undertaking salvage operations, desperate missions to keep a handful of combat submarines operational, to maintain even the thinnest thread of offensive pressure against Allied shipping. The difference is subtle but absolute. A supply mission once meant sustainment. Now it means the difference between a U-boat remaining on patrol for another month or being forced to limp homeward with empty fuel tanks and exhausted stores. The mechanics of these final supply deliveries reveal the erosion of German operational capability in pitiless detail. A surviving Type 14 receives orders, proceed to a designated rendezvous coordinate, arrive within a narrow time window, locate an assigned combat submarine, transfer fuel and provisions, and withdraw. The precision required is extraordinary. Radio signals must remain brief to avoid detection by Allied direction-finding equipment. The rendezvous point cannot be held for more than a few hours. Lingering means death. Yet the very communications that coordinate these meetings are the threads that Allied intelligence follows. British naval cipher specialists work around the clock in their stations at Bletchley Park and elsewhere, and their American counterparts in Washington do the same. When a milk cow transmits a rendezvous coordinate, that message often reaches Allied anti-submarine commanders within hours, sometimes minutes. What appears on German charts as a position of strategic value becomes instead a trap, a coordinates of convergence where hunters await the arrival of their prey. The Type 14 boats that depart in the first months of 1944 carry crews who have absorbed hard lessons from the losses of 1943. Their commanding officers are veterans now, men whose previous boats were sunk or who have survived multiple patrols through waters growing more hostile with each passing week. They know the tactics of the enemy with precision born of close encounter. They understand that the convoy escort groups have become lethally efficient, that escort carrier aircraft operate with a confidence that speaks to overwhelming numerical and technical superiority, that radar-equipped surface vessels can detect a surfaced U-boat at distances that make evasion nearly impossible. Yet they also know that refusing an order means court-martial, possibly execution, and they know that the alternative to attempting a supply mission is the certainty that their assigned combat submarines will have to abandon patrol stations and return to port. representing a strategic loss the German Navy can no longer absorb. The tension this creates is almost unbearable. The knowledge that the mission is likely lethal, undertaken anyway because the alternative is national catastrophe. The rendezvous points themselves have migrated across the Atlantic map, driven by the expanding reach of Allied air patrols and surface forces. In 1943, supply boats met their combat counterparts in mid-Atlantic waters, far enough from land-based air cover to offer relative safety. By early 1944, that distance is no longer sufficient. The range of long-range maritime patrol aircraft has extended dramatically. Consolidated B-24 Liberators, fitted with improved radar and carrying additional anti-submarine ordnance, now operate from bases in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and Portugal, their patrol lines stretching ever further into the Atlantic. Escort carrier task forces position themselves along anticipated U-boat routes, with a sophistication that suggests Allied commanders understand German operating procedures almost as well as the Kriegsmarine does. In desperation, German command attempts to shift rendezvous points into more remote waters, the Caribbean, where some surviving Type 14s operate, the Indian Ocean, where a handful of boats have been redeployed to attack Allied shipping in distant theaters, even the South Atlantic, where the isolation of the waters offers temporary refuge. But remoteness carries its own costs. The transit to these rendezvous points consumes weeks. Fuel reserves diminish before supply transfer even occurs, and in these distant waters, a milk cow separated from its cargo is merely a large, slow U-boat with minimal armament, utterly vulnerable to anything that detects it. Some Type 14 supply boats never locate their assigned wolf packs. The rendezvous coordinate arrives in the assigned U-boat's position, but the scheduled meeting fails. The milk cow appears at the appointed time to find empty water. Possible explanations multiply. The combat submarine may have been diverted to intercept a detected convoy and missed the rendezvous window. It may have been damaged and forced to abandon patrol to limp toward home. It may have been sunk. The Type 14 commanding officer faces an agonizing decision. Continue searching in an area that is now compromised in terms of security. Attempt to contact the missing U-boat via radio, risking detection by direction finding. Proceed to a secondary rendezvous point, consuming fuel and time, or return to port with a full cargo that represents irreplaceable supplies, admitting the mission has failed. Each choice carries weight. Searching means extending exposure to hunter-killer groups that are surely active in the area. Returning means that crews somewhere, U-boat captains and their men aboard combat submarines, will not receive the supplies they desperately need. Some milk cow commanding officers have elected to continue searching, accepting escalating risk in the hope of locating their assigned contact. Some of these boats have disappeared into the Atlantic, their fates unknown but almost surely fatal. The Type 14 boats that do achieve successful rendezvous face a different kind of horror. The transfer of fuel between submarines at sea is a procedure of extraordinary complexity and danger. The milk cow and the combat U-boat must maneuver alongside each other in precise alignment, connected by flexible hoses through which thousands of gallons of fuel flow. The process is slow. The boats are vulnerable. If either vessel is forced to dive suddenly because an aircraft or surface ship is detected, the transfer must be abandoned, the hoses disconnected, the boats separated. The combat submarine departs, carrying perhaps only a portion of its needed fuel. The milk cow, having transferred some supplies but forced to abort the operation, now faces a return journey with partially depleted reserves. And if an air attack or surface engagement occurs during transfer, the consequences are catastrophic. The combat submarine can detach and dive, but the milk cow, loaded with fuel destined for transfer, sits at the surface, defenseless. Fuel ignites. The boat is engulfed in flames. The crew faces the choice between going down with the vessel or entering water covered in burning diesel oil, neither option offering genuine hope of survival. Some milk cows are sunk while in the act of attempting supply deliveries. The historical record preserves fragments of these losses. Vessels detected by Allied air patrols as they surface to meet their assigned contacts, attacked before they can submerge, sunk by depth charges or aerial bombs, their crews either going down with the boat or becoming prisoners of war if they manage to abandon ship. These losses ripple through German naval command with particular sting, because they represent not merely the loss of a submarine, but the loss of supplies that will never reach any U-boat, supplies that represent weeks of labor in German factories and precious shipping space consumed in transport. Each sunken milk cow represents not a ship lost, but an entire supply operation that fails, multiple wolf packs that will lack the resources to extend their patrols, multiple combat submarines that will be forced to abandon patrol and return to port. The cumulative effect is a slow strangulation of German offensive capability, not through defeat in dramatic surface engagements, but through the grinding failure of logistics. The crews of Type 14 boats undertaking these final missions carry a particular burden that distinguishes them from the men of combat submarines. A U-boat sailor sinks a merchant vessel and measures his contribution in tonnage destroyed, in the disruption of Allied supply lines, in the advancement of Germany's strategic objective. But a milk cow sailor sinks without having sunk anything. He does not engage in combat. He is not attempting to destroy an enemy ship or to sink a convoy. He is attempting to transfer fuel and supplies. His mission is not aggressive but enabling, not offensive but logistical. Yet when his boat is sunk, he dies in exactly the same manner as a combat U-boat sailor. He drowns or burns or is crushed by the implosion of a hull at depth. The difference is that his death does not achieve even the minor strategic satisfaction of disrupting enemy operations. It merely represents the failure to sustain other men's patrols. Some crews of Type 14s undertaking missions in 1944 have expressed in their final letters and communications a sense of purposelessness, a recognition that they are not warriors but sacrificial logistics, sent into the Atlantic to die without achieving anything except delay. The disappearance of Type 14 boats into the Atlantic in 1944 occurs with a regularity that strips away any illusion of success. The boats depart from ports under bombardment. They transit across dangerous waters. They attempt rendezvous that may or may not be successful. They either achieve supply transfer or they do not. And then they return, or they do not return. The ones that do return often carry damage from near misses or from attacks that nearly killed them. Their crews emerge from their boats with the 1,000-yard stare of men who have confronted their own mortality. And within days or weeks, another supply mission is ordered. The surviving milk cows are worked to death by an institution that cannot accept that their concept, however brilliant in design, has been rendered obsolete by the overwhelming superiority of Allied anti-submarine forces. The boats go to sea again and again, each voyage against longer odds than the last. By the middle of 1944, the number of Type 14 boats capable of undertaking supply missions has been reduced to a handful. The others rest on the ocean floor, or have been sunk in harbour, or have been scuttled deliberately because the commitment of resources to keep them operational simply no longer makes sense. The surviving milk cows carry out their missions not as flagships of a revitalized strategy, but as ghosts of an abandoned dream. The commanders who take them to sea are not hoping for success in any larger strategic sense. They are hoping merely to survive the patrol, to transfer supplies to whichever combat submarines they encounter, and to return home. The crews are enduring men, trained professionals who have sworn oaths and accepted discipline. They carry out their orders, and they disappear into the Atlantic, one by one, in the grinding campaign of attrition that characterizes the final phase of Germany's U-boat war. The milk cows, which were conceived as the solution to Germany's strategic weakness, have become instead monuments to the impossibility of sustaining a campaign through logistics alone when the underlying military balance has been irrevocably lost. By the middle of 1944, the Atlantic had transformed into something the German High Command no longer recognized. The ocean that had promised victory through commerce raiding, that had sustained the Wolfpack fantasy for 3 long years, had become a graveyard where even the predators were hunted to extinction. The Type 14 supply boats that had once extended German submarine endurance across impossible distances now served a fleet that was itself dissolving. The milk cows had engineered a tactical miracle, yet that miracle operated in service of a strategic collapse so profound that no amount of fuel or provisions could reverse it. The numbers tell a brutal story of arithmetic that admits no recovery. In 1943, when the Type 14 supply boats had entered service, the German U-boat fleet still possessed the capacity to overwhelm convoy defenses through sheer weight of numbers and persistence. Wolf packs of 12, 20, even 40 submarines could gather around Allied merchants, sustain contact through multiple engagements, and inflict catastrophic losses. Yet by the spring of 1944, that aggregate force had contracted catastrophically. Boats were lost faster than replacements could be built. More critically, boats that survived sinking were lost to something more insidious: the crews themselves. Training pipeline failures meant that experienced submarine officers and sailors were impossible to replace, and green crews lacked the tactical understanding to exploit the extended range the milk cows provided. A Type 14 supply boat could extend the operational radius of a combat submarine by hundreds of kilometers, but it could not restore the expertise that had been burned away in the Atlantic campaigns of 1943. The strategic mathematics had shifted with terrifying speed. German planners had calculated that supply boats would allow wolf packs to overwhelm the Allies through sheer persistence and extended pressure. That calculation assumed a baseline level of U-boat force strength. By mid-1944, that baseline had ceased to exist. The Allies were producing escort vessels, anti-submarine vessels, and long-range patrol aircraft at rates that German intelligence had underestimated by catastrophic margins. More importantly, Allied doctrine had evolved into something that the designers of the Type 14 had not adequately anticipated. Radar and radio direction finding had transformed detection from an intermittent occurrence into a systematic hunt. The moment a supply boat transmitted a single radio message to coordinate a rendezvous with its assigned wolf pack, that transmission became a death sentence. Signals intelligence had woven itself so thoroughly into the Allied anti-submarine apparatus that the very communications necessary to sustain the supply boat network became instruments of destruction. Consider the operational tempo of a Type 14 boat attempting to execute a supply run in the summer of 1944. The journey from German-occupied ports itself had become a gauntlet. Allied air attacks had made transit through the English Channel and Bay of Biscay prohibitively expensive in terms of risk. Supply boats attempting to depart from ports in occupied France or Germany faced bomber fleets that had achieved air superiority so complete that daylight transit became suicidal. This forced supply boats to operate under cover of darkness, reducing their surface speed and extending the time required to reach even initial patrol areas. Once at sea, the boat maintained radio silence, knowing that any transmission invited localization and attack. Yet maintaining radio silence meant that the supply boat could not coordinate with the combat submarines it was meant to sustain. Breaking silence for a rendezvous was an act of calculation. Would the fuel delivered justify the risk of death? By mid-1944, the answer increasingly was no. The handful of Type 14 boats that remained operational in the Atlantic found themselves orchestrating supply missions to an enemy that no longer existed in meaningful numbers. The wolf packs that had once gathered in the dozens now assembled in groups of 4 or 5 boats, if they gathered at all. Some combat submarines operated in isolation, conducting individual patrols that lasted mere weeks because there were no supply boats available or no safe rendezvous points. The loss of a single Type 14 represented the loss of support for 8, 10, sometimes 15 combat submarines. As the milk cow fleet contracted, the entire logistical architecture that had been so painstakingly constructed began to collapse under its own weight. A supply boat could carry enough fuel for extended operations, but only if there were combat submarines ready to receive that fuel. By 1944, the matching of supply and demand had become a mismatch that widened with each passing month. The Allies understood this perfectly, and their hunting strategy reflected that understanding. Rather than pursuing only combat submarines, escort carriers and patrol aircraft prioritized Type 14 boats with a vindictiveness that bordered on obsessive. Sinking a supply boat was worth 10 times the tonnage of any individual U-boat because a milk cow's destruction rippled backward through the entire German submarine network. The loss of a single Type 14 could disable the operations of 10 combat submarines simultaneously. This realized asymmetry made Type 14 boats the highest priority targets in the entire German U-boat fleet, yet they had been designed with minimal defensive capabilities. A Type 14 could not dive as deep as modern combat boats. It could not turn as sharply or accelerate as quickly. Its defensive gun armament was pathetic against aircraft or armed trawlers. The boat had been conceived as a supply vessel, not a combatant, and that fundamental design choice had transformed every Type 14 into a trapped animal by mid-1944. The geography of German submarine operations had contracted dramatically during this period. Early in the war, wolf packs had operated with relative freedom across the entire Atlantic, from the American coast to the waters off West Africa. By 1944, German operations had been driven back closer to home. The prime hunting grounds in the North Atlantic were now so heavily defended that individual U-boats operating there faced odds of sinking within their first 2 patrols. German submarines began attempting to operate in distant waters, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, seeking sea lanes where they might encounter convoys without immediately triggering an Allied response. Yet these distant waters were precisely where Type 14 supply boats became invaluable, and they were also where the boats themselves became invisible to any kind of German support or rescue. A supply boat operating in the Indian Ocean in 1944 was operating in a void where interception meant not rescue but death. The psychological weight of this transition manifested in the orders that German commanders issued and the reports they filed. Where 1943 had been characterized by optimism masking desperation, 1944 became characterized by desperation masking the absence of any coherent strategy. Orders to supply boats increasingly contained the phrase operational necessity. which was command's way of sending boats on missions that everyone involved understood to be marginally survivable. A supply boat commanding officer would receive orders to rendezvous with a combat submarine at coordinates that were based on weeks-old intelligence, and if the combat submarine no longer existed, the supply boat would spend days searching a sea zone that had become a hunting ground for Allied aircraft. The boats that executed these final supply missions became monuments to obedience in the face of impossible circumstances. The technical condition of surviving Type 14 boats deteriorated visibly during this period. These vessels had been designed and built between 1942 and 1943, which meant they were now 2 years old, an eternity in the context of submarine warfare. Diesel engines required maintenance that was increasingly difficult to provide. Hull materials had developed stress fractures from repeated deep dives. The specialized cargo handling systems that made the boats unique had worn or been damaged in transit, yet replacement and repair capabilities in German shipyards had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing. The Blitz that had devastated German cities in the early war years had been child's play compared to the systematic industrial bombardment of 1944. Shipyards capable of performing major Type 14 repairs had been destroyed or rendered marginal. This meant that damaged supply boats sometimes remained unseaworthy for weeks or months, and in an environment where every functional submarine was desperately needed, every day in port was a day the boat could not execute a mission. The human dimension of this retreat was equally catastrophic. Type 14 crews understood, through the underground communication networks of sailors everywhere, that their boats were now targets of priority hunting. The realization created a specific kind of terror distinct from the general fear of combat submarines. To sink in a combat boat was to sink in a fight, with some possibility of surface rescue or swimming to another submarine. To sink in a supply boat laden with diesel fuel was to burn and drown simultaneously, and the wreck was likely to be alone on the ocean with no friendly vessels nearby to mount rescue operations. Men volunteered for Type 14 service less frequently, and the quality of volunteered personnel declined. German command responded by assigning submariners to supply boats involuntarily, and this created crews lacking the commitment and psychological resilience that submarine warfare demanded. A boat full of men who did not want to be there, operating under impossible operational conditions, created a pressure cooker of desperation and fatalism. By autumn 1944, the entire edifice of German submarine logistics had ceased to function as originally conceived. The Type 14 supply boat concept had been a genuine innovation, a brilliant solution to the problem of extending combat submarine endurance across the vastness of the Atlantic. Yet that innovation had been premised on a fundamental assumption that Germany would maintain a sufficient force of combat submarines to be worth sustaining. That assumption had been invalidated by the combined weight of Allied air power, surface power, and the superior strategic position that allowed the Allies to replace their losses while Germany could not. A supply boat can fuel a submarine, but it cannot restore a destroyed training pipeline. It can deliver ammunition, but it cannot restore the experience of crews that have been lost. The milk cow fleet had extended the war in the Atlantic by perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year. That extension had cost more tonnage than any other German naval innovation, yet it had ultimately only delayed the inevitable. The final months of 1944 and the opening months of 1945 would see the Type 14 program's dissolution in slow motion. Supply boats attempted their missions with ever-decreasing frequency as the boats themselves were hunted to extinction. The wolf packs they were meant to sustain had become packs in name only, comprised of a handful of submarines operating in remote waters with minimal coordination. The strategic vision that had animated the entire program, the idea that logistics could overcome the Allies' superior production capacity and strategic position, had been revealed as fundamentally mistaken. A Type 14 could extend a submarine's endurance, but it could not extend Germany's capacity to resist. The milk cows became witnesses to their own irrelevance, functional vessels operating in service of a fleet that was ceasing to exist. By mid-1944, they no longer extended the war. They merely reflected the magnitude of the defeat that was already written. By the summer of 1944, the German Kriegsmarine faced a reality so dire that it demanded a complete reimagining of how every remaining asset would be deployed. The Type XIV U-boats, originally conceived as the solution to a single, devastating problem, the need to sustain wolf packs across the Atlantic, found themselves adrift in a naval strategy that no longer bore any resemblance to the ambitions of 3 years prior. The combat submarines they were meant to support had been decimated by superior Allied defenses. The wolf packs that had once terrorized convoys from the Caribbean to the Cape of Good Hope had been scattered, hunted into submission, or sent to the bottom of the ocean. What remained of the German U-boat arm was a fraction of its former strength, and the Type 14 boats, with their cavernous hulls and their specialized cargo systems, had become resources without a clear purpose. In the eyes of German naval command, this was an intolerable situation. These vessels, having survived the gauntlet of Allied anti-submarine warfare, represented irreplaceable capital. They could not simply be retired or mothballed. They could not be left idle in German ports, where they would make perfect targets for Allied bombing raids. They had to be reassigned, repurposed, and deployed toward whatever objectives German military planners still believed were achievable in the final phase of the war. The first of these redeployments involved a mission that carried an almost surreal quality when measured against the Type 14's original purpose. German naval intelligence and command staff determined that surviving milk cows would be converted into transport vessels capable of carrying critical cargo across vast ocean distances without the constraint of wolfpack coordination. These boats would carry machine tools, optical equipment, and specialized industrial materials destined for German military installations in distant theaters where supply lines had effectively ceased to exist. Some were assigned to transport missions between German-controlled ports in occupied France and Norway, running supplies through waters patrolled by an increasingly dominant Allied naval presence. Others received orders to attempt even more ambitious voyages, pushing southward toward the Atlantic coast of Africa, or eastward into the Mediterranean, where isolated German garrisons and naval forces continued to resist long after the larger strategic situation had become hopeless. The conversion of a supply boat into a general-purpose transport required the removal of certain supply transmission equipment and the installation of additional cargo capacity. The resulting vessels lost some of their efficiency as dedicated supply boats, but they gained a marginal increase in flexibility, a trade that seemed increasingly necessary as the war fragmented into multiple desperate rearguard campaigns rather than a coordinated continental strategy. Propaganda operations represented another avenue into which German command directed the Type 14 fleet. The Nazi regime, even as its military position crumbled, maintained an obsessive commitment to psychological warfare and information control. Several milk cows were modified to carry radio broadcasting equipment, leaflets, and other materials designed to be distributed to occupied and neutral nations. The concept was not entirely irrational. A submarine could, in theory, approach neutral territories or occupied regions under cover of darkness and deliver propaganda materials before withdrawing to safety. In practice, These missions were exercises in futility, expensive in terms of the capital required to execute them, and minimal in their strategic impact. Officers commanding these boats were informed by Berlin that they carried materials essential to maintaining German public morale and disrupting enemy unity. But every commander understood that he was operating according to directives generated by a government increasingly disconnected from military reality. The Type 14 boats that undertook these propaganda missions carried crew members whose sense of purpose had been hollowed out by the recognition that they were being asked to perform meaningless tasks while operating under threat of annihilation. Yet the orders were orders, and the boats sailed southward or eastward across oceans that had become thoroughly dominated by Allied air and naval superiority. Covert operations of a more obscure character also claimed several Type 14 boats as the war entered its final phases. German military intelligence, the Abwehr and its successor organizations, possessed various schemes for dropping agents on hostile coastlines, maintaining contact with isolated German operatives in neutral countries, and executing sabotage missions against Allied installations. The large cargo capacity of the milk cows made them suitable platforms for these endeavors. A Type 14 could accommodate sabotage teams, infiltration specialists, and the equipment necessary to sustain covert operations on foreign soil. The historical record of these missions remains fragmentary, obscured by the deliberate destruction of German intelligence archives and the passage of decades that have erased witnesses. What can be established is that at least several Type 14 boats were diverted to such duties, departing from German ports with crews trained in new procedures and objectives radically different from their original training. Whether these missions achieved anything beyond providing their participants with a sense that they were contributing to German resistance remains uncertain. What is clear is that Type 14 boats that might have been deployed against Allied shipping were instead engaged in activities whose strategic significance was, at best, marginal and at worst, entirely illusory. Mine-laying represented a more conventional but equally desperate conversion of the Type 14's capabilities. The German Navy, facing absolute surface inferiority and near total air inferiority, continued to attempt the deployment of minefields as a method of disrupting Allied naval operations and merchant traffic. Type 14 boats, with their substantial cargo capacity, could carry significantly more mines than standard combat U-boats while maintaining the stealth and mobility characteristic of submarines. Several milk cows were fitted with mine-laying equipment and dispatched toward areas where German Naval Command believed that minefields might inflict sufficient damage on Allied shipping to justify the risk. These boats operated under revised orders that eliminated their supply function entirely, transforming them into single-purpose mine-laying platforms. The missions themselves required navigation through waters thoroughly covered by Allied patrols and aircraft. Commanders of these boats faced the technical challenge of deploying mines while maintaining acoustic silence, and the strategic challenge of explaining to their crews why they were being asked to risk the loss of an irreplaceable capital ship to deploy munitions whose marginal tactical effect could barely be calculated. The divergence of the Type 14 fleet into these multiple divergent missions reflected the profound fragmentation that characterized German military planning by 1944. In earlier years, when the Type 14 concept was being developed and the first boats were entering service, German Naval Command operated according to a relatively coherent strategic vision. The supply boats existed to serve the wolf packs, and the wolf packs existed to wage commerce raiding against Allied shipping. The logic was linear, the hierarchy of purpose was clear, and the tactical and strategic objectives aligned with operational capability. By the time these surviving boats were being redeployed, that strategic coherence had disintegrated entirely. The war had evolved from a contest in which Germany might achieve tactical victories and negotiate from a position of some remaining strength into a struggle in which the sole objective was delaying defeat and preserving whatever military assets could be preserved for the post-war period. In this fractured environment, the Type 14 boats became generalist platforms, assigned to whatever missions seemed to offer some marginal possibility of meaningful contribution to German resistance. Some Type 14 boats were redeployed toward support missions for German surface raiders that were attempting, against overwhelming odds, to conduct commerce raiding operations in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. By 1944, these raiders, converted merchant vessels and some capital ships, represented what remained of Germany's surface fleet capable of long-range operations. They faced an Allied naval superiority that made any surface engagement catastrophic, and their supply lines had been severed by Allied convoy escort forces and air patrols. Type 14 boats were assigned to rendezvous with these raiders at remote locations, delivering fuel, ammunition, provisions, and replacement personnel. The operations were conducted with extreme secrecy and often relayed through intermediaries rather than direct radio communication, which itself was an indication of how thoroughly the Allies had penetrated German communications. Surface raider operations were, by this stage of the war, strategic exercises in futility. They might sink occasional merchant vessels, but they could not alter the fundamental imbalance of naval power. Yet they represented the last tangible expression of German naval authority, and supply boats that could sustain these operations were directed to do so, their crews aware that they were engaged in activities that were simultaneously desperate and largely meaningless. Other Type 14 boats received orders to support potential breakout operations involving major German capital ships. As the strategic situation deteriorated, German Naval Command continued to harbor hopes that surviving warships might achieve breakthrough operations into the Atlantic, where they could operate against Allied shipping and potentially force the Allies to divert naval assets from other theaters. The most famous of these hypothetical operations involved the battleship Tirpitz, which occupied an enormous proportion of German strategic imagination, despite being largely confined to Norwegian fjords by Allied naval and air superiority. Type 14 supply boats were identified as critical assets that would enable capital ship breakout operations by providing fuel and supplies at remote rendezvous points that would extend the operational radius of German surface warships. The plans for these breakout operations were detailed and technically sophisticated, yet they were based on assumptions about German naval capability and Allied response patterns that had little connection to contemporary military reality. A Type 14 boat assigned to support a capital ship breakout was, in effect, being positioned to facilitate an operation that would almost surely result in the loss of every vessel involved. The crews of these boats were not always informed of this bleak arithmetic, though experienced naval officers could have calculated it for themselves. The Caribbean and South American theater emerged as another focal point for Type 14 redeployment. German Naval Command, recognizing that the Atlantic had become untenable for U-boat operations, increasingly directed available submarines toward more distant waters where Allied anti-submarine capabilities were less overwhelming. Type 14 boats were assigned to establish supply networks in these remote regions, creating logistical infrastructure that would enable combat submarines to sustain operations thousands of kilometers from German-controlled ports. Boats were dispatched toward the Caribbean, the Brazilian coast, and the waters around neutral nations in South America where they might establish clandestine supply points. These missions represented a dramatic expansion of the operational theatre in which the Type 14 boats were expected to function. They required their crews to navigate across vast ocean distances, to maintain secrecy in waters where German activity had largely ceased to exist, and to accomplish their missions while remaining vulnerable to detection by Allied intelligence agencies and naval forces operating in these theatres. Several Type 14 boats undertook these southbound voyages, their departure from European ports, representing a final commitment to the concept of sustained submarine operations, even as the strategic situation that had once given that concept meaning had fundamentally altered. The Pacific theatre, though distant and apparently peripheral to the primary struggle in Europe, also claimed several Type 14 boats during this final phase of the war. Germany, despite its continental focus, had never entirely abandoned the possibility of supporting Japanese naval operations or maintaining some form of military liaison with its Pacific ally. Type 14 boats were identified as potential assets that could be deployed toward the Indian Ocean and beyond, carrying critical supplies, technical intelligence, and replacement personnel to German naval installations and liaison missions in the Far East. At least one confirmed Type 14 voyage encompassed a transit from European waters through the Atlantic and around Africa into the Indian Ocean, a journey of such epic distance and duration that it represented perhaps the ultimate expression of the submarine's capability as a long-range transport platform. Crews undertaking these missions operated under conditions of extreme isolation, aware that they were operating thousands of kilometers from any friendly port, and that detection by Allied forces would almost surely be fatal. The strategic purpose of these missions was, at best, questionable. Germany's Pacific strategy, such as it was, had ceased to have any meaningful connection to the overall prosecution of the war. Yet these boats sailed nonetheless, their crews fulfilling orders that seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality of German military defeat. By the beginning of 1945, the scattered Type 14 fleet represented a mirror image of German military fragmentation. Surviving boats were deployed across multiple oceans and multiple theatres, pursuing objectives that ranged from supply delivery to propaganda to combat support to covert operations. The original strategic vision, using these boats to sustain wolf packs in sustained commerce raiding, had become entirely secondary. What had been a fleet designed and built according to a unified operational concept had been converted into a collection of individual vessels, each pursuing separate missions according to directives generated by different sections of German command. Some boats were attempting to complete supply missions to combat submarines that no longer existed. Others were transporting cargo to isolated garrisons that had been bypassed by the advance of Allied armies. Still others were carrying personnel and equipment toward objectives that bore no clear relationship to any coherent German strategy. The milk cows, which had represented an innovative solution to a specific strategic problem, had been transformed into generalist platforms engaged in desperate attempts to sustain the appearance of German military capability in the final months before complete defeat. The redeployment of the Type 14 fleet symbolized, perhaps more clearly than any other single aspect of German naval operations, the dissolution of German military strategy in the face of overwhelming Allied superiority. These boats had been born from a genuine insight about logistics and naval power. They had been built with considerable engineering skill and had been operated by crews of considerable professionalism. They had extended German U-boat operations longer than should have been possible, given the state of Allied anti-submarine warfare. Yet in the final phase of the war, they became symbols not of German resourcefulness, but of German desperation. Platforms assigned to missions that seemed designed primarily to provide the illusion of continued military capability, rather than to achieve any meaningful strategic objective. The scattered redeployment of the Type 14 fleet across multiple theaters and multiple mission profiles represented the recognition by German command that these boats, whatever they had been originally intended to accomplish, could not be allowed to remain idle. In a military structure increasingly characterized by the absence of rational strategic planning, these boats had to continue to operate, to attempt to accomplish missions, to provide evidence that German resistance continued even as that resistance became increasingly futile. The Type 14 boats, in their final redeployments, became witnesses to the end of German military power, engaged in operations that revealed, with perfect clarity, the gulf between German ambition and German capability that had come to define the final phase of the war. By 1944, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard for the Type 14 supply boats. The waters that once promised extended operational range now offered only diminishing refuge. What remained of Germany's milk cow fleet, fewer than a dozen vessels still capable of active service, faced a reality their designers had never anticipated, a war where logistics had become irrelevant because the submarines they were meant to sustain no longer existed in operational strength. The wolf packs had been decimated across 2 years of escalating Allied anti-submarine warfare. The Type 14 boats had accomplished their mission with grim efficiency, extending campaigns that kept tonnage sinking and pressure mounting far longer than circumstances should have allowed. Yet that very success had earned them a place at the top of every Allied priority list for destruction. By the time these boats prepared for what might be their final missions, they sailed toward an enemy not fighting for victory, but for absolute dominance of the seas. The choice facing each surviving Type 14 commander crystallized into stark alternatives as 1944 progressed into its final months. Remain in the Atlantic and face almost certain destruction through depth charge, aerial torpedoes, or ramming by surface vessels grown bold in their supremacy. Attempt passage to distant neutral ports, perhaps Sweden, Switzerland, or ports in South America, where boats might theoretically disappear into internment or clandestine resupply, or undertake what German command euphemistically termed special operations, missions designed not for survival, but for maximum damage inflicted before sinking. These were not decisions made in conference rooms, but rather the bitter calculus of men who had watched their fleet collapse around them. Each commanding officer understood that the war was lost, that Germany would not achieve victory, and that the boats under their command had become expendable. Some commanders chose to fight this knowledge away. Others accepted it with the quiet resignation of professionals watching their profession consumed by history. The ports that had once launched these supply boats with ceremony and strategic purpose now reverberated with the sounds of Allied bombing. Hamburg, Bremen, Kiel, and Wilhelmshaven faced constant air attack through 1944 and into 1945. The shipyards that had built the Type 14 fleet lay in ruins. The admirals who had ordered their construction had either been reassigned, killed, or fallen into disgrace as the full scope of the U-boat arms failure became undeniable. When surviving Type 14 boats put to sea, they departed from harbours themselves under threat of annihilation, navigating between bomb craters and past burning dock facilities. The crews manning these boats knew they were leaving a homeland already defeated. Germany's cities burned. The Red Army pressed from the east. The Americans and British advanced from the west. The Atlantic, where the milk cows had once fought a strategic campaign, became merely one theatre in a continental catastrophe. These final missions were not undertaken with hope, but with the grim determination of soldiers executing orders they understood were futile. By autumn 1944, several Type 14 boats attempted to reach the Indian Ocean and Pacific theatres, where German commerce raiders and isolated garrisons still fought on, unaware that Germany's strategic position had become untenable. These voyages were odysseys of evasion, with boats navigating around Allied patrol zones, hugging coastlines, and timing their surface runs through the narrowest windows of opportunity. One supply boat, U-793, successfully transited the Cape of Good Hope and eventually reached the Indian Ocean, where it attempted to resupply German surface commerce raiders that were themselves hunted toward extinction. The voyage took months. Every mile traveled was contested space. The crews aboard these boats existed in a state of perpetual tension, knowing that any Allied patrol aircraft or surface vessel might mean their final surface. They refueled when they could, resupplied isolated German submarines clinging to existence in distant waters, and moved through an enemy-controlled ocean with the stealth of ghosts haunting a battlefield long after the battle had ended. These were operations of profound dedication and equally profound futility. Certain Type 14 boats received modified orders reflecting German desperation in the war's final phase. Instead of meeting wolf packs to deliver fuel, they became transport vessels carrying specialized cargo, sometimes supplies for isolated garrisons in the Atlantic islands, sometimes equipment for covert operations that would alter nothing but represented the last gestures of a regime refusing to acknowledge its extinction. Some boats were fitted with additional defensive armament, though this only slowed them further and consumed space previously devoted to cargo. Others received experimental modifications intended to improve their chances, improved radar detection systems copied from captured Allied equipment, enhanced periscope designs, modified hull coatings, theoretically providing better stealth. None of these improvements addressed the fundamental vulnerability that defined the Type 14 in 1944. They were slow, they were valuable, and they sailed through waters dominated absolutely by their enemies. The modifications were not solutions, but rather desperate attempts to make peace with inevitability, to feel as though something was being done even as German naval power dissolved into memory. The intelligence picture available to German Naval Command in 1944 painted a portrait of catastrophe. Allied direction finding had grown so sophisticated that German radio transmissions could be located within hours. Convoy routes were known before ships departed port. Air patrols covered vast stretches of the Atlantic with deadly efficiency. The few combat submarines still operational spent more time evading enemy hunters than engaging merchant vessels. Supply missions faced constant danger, not from the act of refueling, but simply from the requirement to transmit coordinates and rendezvous locations that the Allies were almost surely intercepting and reading. German commanders who still possessed the luxury of strategic thought understood that sending a Type 14 boat to sea was almost surely sentencing its crew to death. Yet orders were orders. The German Navy, even as it died, continued to function as an institution, with discipline and hierarchy. Boats were assigned missions. Crews carried them out. Some commanding officers attempted to mitigate the danger through daring tactics, deeper diving to avoid aircraft, running submerged during daylight hours regardless of battery consumption, accepting the hunger and exhaustion of crews confined in darkness to gain even minimal survival advantage. The psychological burden on crews of these final Type 14 missions cannot be understated. A young sailor aboard a milk cow in late 1944 knew statistically that his boat would not survive the war. He knew his country was defeated. He knew that if his boat was sunk, rescue was unlikely. The distances were too vast, the rescue resources too few, and the Allies too focused on destroying remaining German vessels. These men faced a choice: desert their posts and face certain execution, or remain aboard submarines heading toward probable death. Many chose to remain. Discipline held, professionalism held, the traditions of the German Navy held. They performed their duties with precision and maintained their boats with meticulous attention, knowing that every function they performed might be their last, every dive cycle possibly the final one, every night on the surface a temporary reprieve rather than hope. Some boats' crews kept watches as though they might see dawn 3 years hence. Others maintained their equipment with the knowing finality of men tending a tomb. As 1945 dawned, the handful of Type 14 boats remaining unsunk faced strategic uncertainty that transcended mere tactical concerns. Germany's cities were falling. Berlin itself would be under siege within months. The Reich's eastern front had collapsed catastrophically. German surface vessels were being hunted to destruction or scuttled in harbours to prevent capture. The logical conclusion that Germany had lost the war was now impossible to deny even to those in deepest denial. Some Type 14 boats received orders to proceed to German-controlled ports that no longer existed or would cease to exist within weeks. Others were instructed to attempt transit to ports in occupied territories, Norway, France, Denmark, where they might theoretically base themselves and continue operations. The orders sometimes contradicted one another, reflecting the chaos of a disintegrating command structure. Some commanding officers ignored orders entirely and made independent decisions about where their boats might find survival, or, if survival was impossible, where they might at least surrender to enemies they might expect to treat them as professional military men rather than war criminals. The scuttling of German vessels, sinking them deliberately to prevent capture, became an increasingly common choice for Type 14 commanders in the final months. Several supply boats were deliberately flooded and sunk in harbours by their own crews, rather than allow them to fall into Allied hands intact. The rationale was partly psychological, partly strategic, maintaining the dignity of the German Navy by denying the enemy the technical intelligence a captured Type 14 might provide. By performing one